It began at the very edge of possibility, the farthest point the last German offensive would ever reach, the final breath of a dream collapsing under snow and steel. It was late December 1944, in the frozen heart of Belgium, where narrow roads twisted through the forests and farmland of the Ardennes. The once quiet village of Celles, nestled among rolling hills and stone farmhouses, suddenly found itself at the center of the most desperate gamble of the entire war. Hitler's final offensive, the winter thrust meant to break the Allied front, split their armies, and force a negotiated peace, had been roaring westward toward the Meuse River. At its spear point were the armored veterans of the elite 2nd Pan-zer Division, their tanks commanded by the legendary WW2, men who still believed victory might be torn from the jaws of ruin. For a brief flickering moment, they stood closer to the Meuse than any German force would ever reach again. This is the entire history of the Battle of Celles, the farthest German advance of the Battle of the Bulge, the moment hope turned to exhaustion, and the point where ambition finally froze to death beneath the winter sky. To understand Celles, you must return to the beginning, to the shock of December 16th. The Allies believed the Ardennes was quiet, a sector held by inexperienced American divisions recovering from months of combat. But at dawn, an artillery barrage ripped the silence apart, and German armor surged through the woods like an avalanche of steel. At the northern axis of that advance was the 6th SS Panzer Army under Zepp Dietrich, while further south the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, charged forward with remarkable skill and speed. Their goal was clear: reach the Meuse River, cross its icy waters, and race toward the port of Antwerp. If they reached that river, the Western Front would split in half. The Allies would collapse into confusion. The war, at least in Hitler's mind, could be reversed. The task fell largely to the center thrust. The 2nd Panzer Division, a unit forged in the early victories of France and hardened in the deserts of North Africa. They were some of the best armored troops Germany still had left, veterans who knew how to move with speed, strike without hesitation, and exploit every weakness. Their commander, Harmon Goetzky, was a man of instinct and aggression, the kind of officer who led from the front and pushed his men forward even when the roads were snow-choked and fuel was running thin. And fuel, not courage, not skill, would soon become the decisive element in the story. Through the villages of Houffalize, Marche and Houffalize, the 2nd Panzer Division moved like a blade through ice. They bypassed resistance, crushed roadblocks, and slipped past units that were still trying to understand what was happening. They were ghosts in the fog, faster than radio reports, faster than American intelligence. As Christmas approached, they reached the village of Celles. Its church bell tower overlooked the surrounding hills and narrow valleys. Beyond those hills lay Dinant and the Meuse. The division had achieved what every German unit was trying to do. They had punched through the Allied line deeper than anyone else. But at Celles the miracle stopped. While the Germans had raced forward, the Americans had reacted with astonishing speed from the south. General Patton's Third Army swung north with a maneuver so rapid that even his own staff doubted it could be done. From the west, the 9th Armored Division and fast-moving units of the 2nd Armored Division began closing in. And from the north, elite American infantry tightened the cordon. The trap was forming, the jaws closing. Celles sat in the center of a storm that was tightening hour by hour. On December 24th, the advance stalled. The tanks had no fuel. The crews siphoned gasoline from abandoned American vehicles, hoping for a miracle that never came. Snow fell. Engines froze. What had been a spearhead now became an island of steel with empty fuel tanks. By December 25th, Christmas Day, Patton's men struck. Sherman tanks emerged over the ridges, American artillery zeroed in on the helpless Panthers, and fighter bombers swooped overhead to finish the job. The elite German advance that had once threatened to rewrite the map of Europe now became a cemetery of burning armor. The battle lasted for 3 relentless days. Every crossroads, every farmhouse, every snowy field became a firefight. German crews abandoned their tanks and fought on foot, trying to break out through the tightening noose. Some escaped east, stumbling through the snow. Others never left the village. The burning hulks of Panthers and Shermans lit the night sky. By December 27th, it was over. The German spearhead had been shattered. The 2nd Panzer Division, once the very tip of Hitler's final gamble, was now broken beyond recovery. Celles became the high watermark of the offensive, the farthest point the German army would ever reach in the west again. After Celles, the Bulge began to deflate. The dream of reaching Antwerp evaporated. The Reich had spent its last strength, its last fuel, and its last hope. Today, Celles is quiet, a peaceful village surrounded by hills and meadows. But if you walk its fields, you can still feel it. Beneath the soil lie shards of metal and fragments of history, the farthest point of a gamble that shattered against reality. The Battle of Celles was not just a tactical defeat. It was the moment a dying empire realized that willpower and fanaticism could not replace fuel and facts. It was the point where ambition froze, where steel stopped, where hope died. Tonight we return to that snowy ridge, to the crossroads where tanks ran dry, where frostbitten soldiers stared west toward a river they would never reach, and where history pivoted from possibility to collapse. This is the entire history of the Battle of Celles, the farthest German advance of the Bulge, the moment the last offensive ran out of fuel, and the point where a war of dreams finally hit the wall of reality. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere peaceful and warm, far from those frozen fields? Or can you almost feel that winter wind as engines fade into silence? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. December 23rd, 1944, evening. Somewhere in the rolling hills near Marche, Belgium, Private First Class James McKinley of the 84th Infantry Division sits in a requisitioned farmhouse writing a letter by candlelight. Outside, snow falls softly on American trucks parked in neat rows. The men around him play cards, heat rations over a small fire, talk about Christmas dinner and the war ending by February. No one has seen combat in weeks. This is supposed to be a rest area, miles behind the front lines, a place where exhausted infantry recover before the final push into Germany. In 6 hours, everything McKinley believes about where the war stands will prove catastrophically wrong. The confidence filling that farmhouse, multiplied across dozens of American positions throughout the Ardennes forest, represents one of the most dangerous assumptions of the Second World War. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and his staff believe the German army is defeated in all but name, incapable of mounting anything more than local counterattacks. Intelligence estimates predict Germany can field perhaps 50 divisions, most understrength and demoralized. The Ardennes sector, a quiet backwater of dense forest and poor roads, holds only 4 American divisions stretched across 85 miles of front. It's considered the safest posting in Europe, a place to rest veteran units and blood new ones. What Allied intelligence has catastrophically failed to detect is that Germany has assembled 70 divisions, 28 of them armored or mechanized, for the largest offensive the Wehrmacht will ever launch in the West. At 3 o'clock in the morning on December 24th, a duty officer at 2nd Armored Division headquarters receives fragmentary reports that make no sense. Unidentified tank columns are moving west, somewhere beyond Bastogne. The coordinates place them impossibly far behind what everyone believes is the German front line. The officer checks his maps, assumes the reports describe American units, files the intelligence as routine. Similar reports filter into command posts across Belgium, each one dismissed or minimized because they don't fit the prevailing narrative. The German army shouldn't be capable of this. Therefore, it must be something else. This is how armies lose wars, not through lack of courage, but through failure of imagination. Dawn breaks over Belgium, with the kind of fog that swallows landscapes whole. American sentries at forward positions near Hotten and Dinant strain to see beyond 50 yards. What they hear when the wind shifts sounds like distant thunder, but the weather is wrong for storms, and the sound doesn't stop. It rolls across the hills in waves, mechanical and purposeful. Some veterans recognize it immediately, feel their stomachs tighten with a fear they thought they'd left behind in Normandy. It's the sound of tracked vehicles, dozens of them, moving fast on paved roads. By the time commanders realize what they're hearing, the lead elements of 2nd Panzer Division, WW2 pan-zer DVZ have already advanced 90 kilometers in 7 days, the deepest penetration of the entire Ardennes offensive. Aerial reconnaissance finally provides proof that overwhelms disbelief. Photo analysts at 1st Army headquarters develop film from a morning sortie and find themselves staring at images that seem impossible. A German armored column stretches back more than 25 kilometers, a steel snake of tanks, half-tracks, and supply vehicles pointed like a dagger at the Meuse River. The analysts count tanks, recount them, check their math against intelligence estimates of German capabilities. The numbers don't reconcile with what they've been told is possible. But reconnaissance cameras don't lie, and neither do the Belgian civilians now flooding westward past American positions, speaking in frantic French and Flemish about many panzers coming. Most American soldiers don't speak either language, but they understand terror when they see it. Major General Ernest Harmon, commander of 2nd Armored Division, studies the intelligence briefing with the expression of a man watching a house of cards collapse. His division, supposedly in reserve for the spring offensive into Germany, suddenly finds itself the only significant American armored force between a German spearhead and the Meuse River bridges. The map makes the situation terrifyingly clear. The lead German units are at Celles, a small village no one has heard of, just 8 kilometers from the Meuse. If they cross the river, if they establish even a small bridgehead, the entire Allied position in Belgium unravels. 25 divisions could find themselves cut off, surrounded, forced to surrender, or fight their way back west. It would be a catastrophe dwarfing anything since Dunkirk. What Harmon doesn't know yet, what no one in the American command structure has pieced together, is that the German spearhead is already dying. Kampfgruppe Farm, the forward element of 2nd Panzer Division, consists of approximately 2,500 men, 88 tanks, mixing Panthers and Panzer IVs, and fuel tanks hovering near 40% capacity. They've covered 90 kilometers fighting continuous delaying actions, bypassing American strongpoints, racing against time and logistics toward an objective that looks tantalizingly close. But 40% fuel capacity for a Panther tank, which consumes 2 liters per kilometer on roads and 4 cross-country, means perhaps 20 kilometers of movement remaining. The Meuse River lies 8 kilometers ahead. The nearest German fuel depot sits 90 kilometers behind, a crossroads now swarming with American reinforcements. The weather on December 24th decides more than tactical convenience. Dense fog, freezing rain, and cloud cover, sitting at 300 feet, prevent Allied air power from functioning. The fighter bombers and medium bombers that could turn the German column into a junkyard of burning steel sit grounded at airfields across France, pilots drinking coffee and cursing the weather. This is precisely what German planners counted on, this window of winter storms that would neutralize Allied air superiority and allow ground forces to operate freely. But weather serves both sides unpredictably. The same fog hiding German tanks from American aircraft also prevents German reconnaissance from spotting American armor moving towards Sellers from 3 directions. Both sides are fighting partially blind, making decisions based on fragmentary information and best guesses. In the farmhouse near Marche, Private McKinley and his squad receive orders that transform their comfortable evening into chaos. They're moving out immediately. No time to finish letters or clean weapons properly. Just grab your gear and mount up. The officers won't say where they're going or what they're facing, but McKinley sees the tension in their faces and knows it's serious. The convoy rolls east into fog so thick the trucks navigate by following taillights, barely 20 feet between vehicles, moving towards sounds of artillery fire that grow steadily louder. Men check ammunition, fix bayonets, try not to think too hard about why a rest area suddenly became a combat zone. This is how most soldiers experience war, not through grand strategy or heroic charges, but through confused orders and movement toward danger they don't fully understand. The German advance, viewed from American positions, seems unstoppable because no one grasps how close it is to collapse. Intelligence officers plot tank sightings on maps and see a massive force driving forward with apparent confidence. What they can't see from map symbols and spot reports is the reality inside those tanks. German crews are exhausted, having fought continuously for 7 days with minimal sleep, pushing their vehicles to mechanical limits. Every Panther that breaks down gets abandoned because there's no recovery capability this far forward. Every engagement burns precious ammunition and fuel. The column stretches longer and thinner each day, units losing contact with each other, supply vehicles falling behind or getting picked off by American stragglers. It looks like a blitzkrieg on the maps. From inside it feels like desperation. At Celles itself, a village of perhaps 200 people, Belgian civilians hide in cellars and listen to tank engines rumbling through streets never meant for armored vehicles. Some remember 1940, when German tanks passed through in triumph during the conquest of France. This sounds different, less organized, more frantic. German soldiers dismount from half-tracks, commandeer houses for observation posts, speak in terse commands that need no translation. The civilians understand they're trapped between 2 armies about to collide. They gather children into the deepest cellars, pool food and water, pray the house above them doesn't take a direct hit. War for civilians isn't about tactics or strategy. It's about making yourself small and hoping the shells land somewhere else. The scope of German failure sits in logistics reports that won't be properly analyzed until after the war. 2nd Panzer Division started Operation Wacht am Rhein with 27,000 men, 146 tanks, full fuel loads, and promises of resupply convoys that would follow the advance. By December 24th, division strength has collapsed to approximately 12,000 effective combat troops. Tank strength dropped to 88 operational vehicles, with another 30 broken down or abandoned along the route. The promised fuel resupply never materialized. Air resupply proved impossible due to Allied air superiority during weather breaks, and the division has covered 90 kilometers while fighting continuously, an average of nearly 11 kilometers per day through hostile territory, a pace that looks impressive until you calculate fuel consumption against available stocks. What makes Sales significant in the broader Ardennes offensive isn't just that it represents the farthest German advance. It's that this village marks the point where tactical success collided with strategic impossibility. German commanders from Adolf Hitler downward conceived the Ardennes offensive as a repetition of 1940, a lightning strike that would split Allied armies, capture supplies, and create chaos, allowing Germany to dictate peace terms. But 1944 isn't 1940. The Allies have depth, reserves, industrial capacity, and most critically, awareness of what German tactics look like. The Wehrmacht in December 1944 is attempting blitzkrieg with units bled white on the Eastern Front, fuel stocks measured in days not months, and facing an enemy who learned from defeat and came back stronger. As December 24th becomes December 25th, as American soldiers spend Christmas morning moving toward combat and German soldiers spend it defending positions they can't hold, the Battle of Sels crystallizes into something larger than tactics. It becomes a test of two opposing visions of what's possible. The Germans believe that audacity, tactical excellence, and superior equipment can overcome material disadvantage. The Americans believe that logistics, numbers, and coordinated application of force will prevail over tactical brilliance. In the farmhouses and forests around Sels, in the snow-covered fields and frozen creek beds, young men who never chose these philosophies will fight and die to prove one side right. The battle will answer a question neither army has asked directly: can a better tank win a war when it has no fuel? The Christmas ghosts haunting the Ardennes aren't supernatural. They're the phantoms of false assumptions, the spectre of what high commands believed versus what actually existed on the ground. American commanders believed the Germans were beaten and incapable of offensive action. German commanders believed they could recreate the victories of 1940 with a fraction of the resources. Belgian civilians believed their liberation would bring safety rather than becoming a battlefield. All these beliefs, comfortable and seemingly reasonable, shatter against the reality of steel and violence converging on a village most couldn't find on a map. History turns not on what people know, but on what they refuse to believe until confronted with irrefutable proof. And proof, in December 1944, comes wrapped in armor plate and moving at 30 kilometers per hour toward objectives it will never reach. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes forest erupts with artillery fire so massive that American soldiers 40 kilometers away feel the ground shake beneath their feet. 1,600 guns firing simultaneously create a rolling thunder that seems to crack the winter sky itself. This is the opening barrage of Operation Wacht am Rhein, and for the men of Kampfgruppe von Bern, it signals the beginning of something they've been told is impossible. Germany is attacking, not defending, driving west instead of falling back, attempting to reverse 4 years of retreat with one desperate offensive. In the command post, Oberst Meinrad von Laucher, Oberst Meinrad von Lokert, briefs his officers with words that sound more like a prayer than military orders. Berlin or bust, gentlemen. We reach the Meuse or we die trying. The German plan for the Ardennes offensive represents ambition unmoored from logistics. Supreme Commander West, Field Marshal Gerd von Röhnstedt, received orders directly from Hitler to assemble 3 armies totaling 28 divisions and strike through the weakest point of the Allied line. The objective: cross the Meuse River, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the British and American armies, capture Allied supply dumps, and force negotiation from a position of strength. On paper, with colored arrows on maps at Row headquarters, it looks achievable. On the ground, with fuel trucks that never arrive and supply lines stretched across France to breaking point, it's fantasy. But soldiers don't get to question strategy, they get orders to advance, and so 2nd Panzer Division rolls forward into the fog and the gunfire, 27,000 men convinced they're about to change the course of the war. For the first 3 days, the offensive succeeds beyond anyone's realistic expectations. American defensive positions, thinly spread and often manned by inexperienced units, collapse or withdraw in confusion. German armor exploits gaps, bypassing strong points, moving faster than American command can process the information. Radio reports flood into Allied headquarters, describing attacks everywhere simultaneously, creating the impression of overwhelming force when the reality is more complex. The German advance works not through strength, but through American weakness, through the gaps between divisions and the fog of confusion that prevents coherent response. By December 20th, 2nd Panzer Division's lead elements have covered 60 kilometers, destroyed or scattered multiple American units, and begun to believe the propaganda about German superiority over the materially rich but spiritually weak Americans. At Houffalize on December 20th, Kampfgruppe von Böhm bypasses the smoldering remains of an American convoy that fought and died in a futile delaying action. The German tank crews, buttoned up inside their Panthers and Panzer IVs, see burned-out trucks and jeeps, American bodies sprawled in ditches, equipment abandoned in panic. Radio operators intercept American transmissions, frantic calls for reinforcements, reports of German tanks everywhere, requests for permission to withdraw. It's the sound of an army in crisis, and for soldiers who've spent 4 years retreating across Europe, it feels like vindication. Maybe the Führer was right. Maybe one last great offensive really can turn defeat into victory. Maybe courage and superior German arms really do outweigh American material superiority. These thoughts, dangerous and intoxicating, spread through the ranks like infection. But fuel tells a different story than tactical success. Every kilometer advanced consumes fuel that cannot be replaced. The Panther tank, perhaps the finest medium tank design of the war, is also an automotive glutton. Its Maybach HL 230P30 engine produces 700 horsepower and devours 2 liters of fuel per kilometer on paved roads, 4 or more cross-country through snow and mud. Simple math becomes existential crisis. A Panther carries 730 liters of fuel internally. At best efficiency, that's 365 kilometers of range on roads. 2nd Panzer Division has already traveled 60 kilometers and fought multiple engagements that demanded maneuvering, idling engines, and high-speed dashes. By December 22nd, forward units are below 50% fuel capacity, and the promised resupply convoys haven't appeared. The fuel crisis transforms from concern to catastrophe on December 23rd when German tankers capture an American supply depot at Orthieville. The excitement at finding intact fuel stores turns to despair when they realize it's all gasoline, not diesel. Panther and Panzer IV engines run on diesel. Gasoline is worse than useless. Pumping it into diesel tanks would destroy the engines. The irony is visceral and bitter. They're surrounded by fuel they cannot use, kilometers from the Meuse River, victory visible on maps but unreachable in practice. Crews begin cannibalizing fuel from broken-down vehicles, towing tanks behind tanks to conserve what little remains. The offensive that started with thunder and confidence now runs on fumes and desperation. Von Larcher faces impossible mathematics. His orders demand that he reach the Meuse River at all costs, establish a bridgehead, and wait for reinforcements. The distance remaining 15 to 20 kilometers depending on route. Available fuel enough for perhaps 10 kilometers of movement, less if they encounter resistance. No resupply en route. No air support due to Allied air superiority. No reinforcements close enough to matter. A rational officer would halt, consolidate, preserve his force for a fighting withdrawal. But rationality has no place in Hitler's strategic vision. The orders are explicit. 2nd Panzer Division must reach the Meuse and hold. Withdrawal is forbidden. Commanders who retreat will face court-martial. So von Larchert does what officers have done throughout history when trapped between impossible orders and ground truth. He advances anyway, hoping something changes before his tanks become monuments to failed ambition. December 24th, 6 o'clock in the morning. The lead reconnaissance element of Kampfgruppe von Boehm reaches Notre-Dame, a village sitting just 4 kilometers from Celles and 8 kilometers from the Meuse River bridges. Through morning mist and fog, using binoculars with frost-rimmed lenses, German officers can actually see the river valley in the distance. It's the closest any German unit will come to the Meuse during the entire Ardennes offensive. For a moment, standing in the freezing dawn, they allow themselves to imagine what crossing that river might mean. Fuel depots on the far side, Antwerp 60 kilometers beyond, the British army cut off, the Americans reeling. Maybe, just maybe, the impossible becomes possible. Then reality reasserts itself. Radio reports confirm that American armor is moving to intercept them from 3 directions. Fuel gauges show red, and the promised reinforcements remain promises, nothing more. The experience of German soldiers during these days combines exhilaration and terror in equal measure. They're advancing, after years of nothing but retreat, pushing back the enemy, seeing fear in American eyes. It feels like 1940 again, like the great victories of France and Poland, like the beginning of the war when Germany seemed invincible. But underneath the exhilaration runs cold understanding. Veterans, especially those who survived the Eastern Front, recognize the signs: supply columns that don't arrive, air cover that never appears, orders to advance without regard for flanks or rear security. They've seen this before, in Russia, in Italy, in Normandy. It's how Germany fights now, throwing units forward in desperate gambles, achieving local successes that lead to strategic disasters. The young soldiers, the ones conscripted in 43 and 44, don't understand yet. The veterans do, and their silence speaks volumes. What makes 2nd Panzer Division's advance remarkable isn't just distance, but the sustained combat tempo. 90 kilometers in 7 days while fighting continuous delaying actions represents extraordinary tactical performance. This isn't a road march through undefended territory. It's armored warfare against an enemy that, while initially confused, never stops fighting. Every village requires clearing. Every bridge must be taken intact or engineers must ford streams. American artillery, even when retreating, continues to fire. Small unit actions, squad-level fights, ambushes from tree lines, all accumulate into constant attrition. The division that started with 27,000 men has lost roughly 15,000 to casualties, capture, exhaustion, or simply falling behind and losing contact. The tanks that remain operational do so through mechanical miracles performed by exhausted crews doing battlefield repairs under fire. The human cost of the advance rarely appears in after-action reports or historical accounts focused on tank numbers and territorial gains. But inside those tanks, inside the half-tracks and trucks, are teenagers and middle-aged fathers, farmers and factory workers, pressed into uniforms, many of them believing they're defending Germany against enemies who will destroy their homeland. Some are committed Nazis who've internalized the ideology completely. Most are simply soldiers following orders, trapped by conscription and military discipline in a war they didn't start and can't stop. They write letters home talking about final victory because censors require optimism. But private diaries tell different stories. Stories of frostbite and exhaustion, of friends dying in burning tanks, of wondering whether their families survived the latest bombing raid on Hamburg or Berlin. War doesn't pause for Christmas, but soldiers still feel its absence. By December 24th afternoon, Kampfgruppe von Böhm's position has transformed from spearhead to trap. The unit holds a roughly 8-kilometer perimeter centered on Celles, Conzu, and Foy-Notre-Dame. Behind them, American forces have cut the roads back to German lines. Ahead, British armor positions along the Meuse River prevent further advance. To both sides, American armored divisions are maneuvering for envelopment. The Germans have driven deep into Allied territory, achieved tactical surprise, and reached positions that look impressive on maps. But they're isolated, low on fuel and ammunition, with no prospect of relief or resupply. Military historians have a term for this situation: culminating point of attack, the moment when an offensive exhausts its capability to continue and becomes vulnerable to counterattack. 2nd Panzer Division reached its culminating point somewhere around December 22nd, but lacked the authority or fuel to withdraw. So they wait at Celles, preparing defenses, rationing ammunition, and watching American positions grow stronger by the hour. Hitler's interference in operational decisions turns a difficult situation into catastrophe. When von Rundstedt requests permission to pull 2nd Panzer back to defensible positions, Hitler refuses. The Führer, commanding from his bunker at Adlerhorst headquarters, hundreds of kilometers away, sees only map symbols and refuses to accept that his grand offensive is collapsing. He orders 2nd Panzer to hold at Celles regardless of fuel status, promises reinforcements that don't exist, and threatens court-martial for any commander who retreats without authorization. This is how totalitarian command structure destroys armies. Junior officers know the tactical reality, understand their position is untenable, but cannot act on that understanding without authorization from superiors who refuse to accept ground truth. So the trap closes around Celles, and the men of 2nd Panzer Division prepare to defend positions they know are indefensible, following orders they know are senseless, because the alternative is execution for cowardice. The final irony of the German advance to Celles is that it succeeds too well. If 2nd Panzer had been stopped 30 kilometers earlier, the division might have withdrawn in good order, preserved its strength, fought another day. By reaching Celles, by coming tantalizingly close to the Meuse River, the spearhead drives so deep into Allied territory that extraction becomes impossible. Every kilometer forward was paid in fuel that cannot be recovered. Every bridge crossed became a bridge that American forces could seize behind them. The audacity that makes the advance remarkable also ensures its destruction. This is the paradox of armored warfare. When logistics fail, mobility becomes immobility, offensive action transforms into static defense, and the spear point becomes a target surrounded by enemies who finally understand the threat and can mass forces for destruction. The men at Celles don't need military historians to explain these concepts. They can count the hours of fuel remaining, see American positions multiplying around them, and understand perfectly well what's coming. As Christmas Eve becomes Christmas morning, as German soldiers at Celles prepare defensive positions and American tankers advance toward contact, the Battle of Celles enters its decisive phase. The strategic question has been answered. Germany will not reach the Meuse River, will not split the Allied armies, will not force negotiated peace. What remains is the tactical question. How many men will die proving what logistics already demonstrates? This is the difference between maps at headquarters and reality on the ground. Headquarters sees symbols and possibilities. Soldiers see frozen earth to dig through, fields with no cover, and tanks that might fire 3 more times before ammunition runs out. They don't fight for grand strategy anymore. If they ever did, they fight because the enemy is approaching, because their comrades depend on them, because surrender feels like betrayal, even when continued resistance guarantees death. The spear point has become a sacrificial offering on the altar of strategic fantasy. The men at cells just don't know how many of them constitute an acceptable sacrifice. Inside a Panther tank, December 24th, 1944. The interior reeks of cordite, diesel fumes, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear that crew members won't acknowledge. Hans Müller sits hunched over his telescope sight, scanning the tree line 300 meters distant, where American infantry disappeared minutes ago. His right hand rests on the firing trigger for the 75mm KV 42 L70 gun, the most powerful tank gun Germany has mounted on a medium tank. This weapon can penetrate 150mm of armor at 1,000 meters, can destroy any Allied tank from ranges where return fire is ineffective. It's a technological masterpiece that makes the Panther superior to almost anything the Allies field. But superiority measured in gun penetration and armor thickness means nothing when the tank has no fuel to maneuver and no ammunition for sustained combat. Müller has 12 armor-piercing rounds remaining, then his perfect gun becomes an expensive paperweight. The technical specifications that made German tanks feared also made them logistically catastrophic. The Panther Ausfuß Ausführung, the variant most common at Celles, weighs 44.8 metric tons combat loaded. Its front armor is 100mm thick, angled at 55 degrees, creating effective thickness of over 180mm. American Sherman tanks, firing 75mm M3 guns, cannot penetrate Panther front armor beyond 500 meters, even with ideal hit angles. But engineering excellence comes with costs rarely mentioned in propaganda. That 44.8-ton weight, combined with the Maybach HL 230P30 engine, means the Panther consumes fuel at rates that outpace German logistics capacity. The sloped armor that makes it invulnerable frontally also makes it vulnerable to side shots. And the complex transmission, while effective when maintained, fails frequently under combat conditions. 2nd Panzer Division started the Ardennes offensive with 146 tanks. By December 24th, more were lost to mechanical breakdown than enemy action. Across the fields at Celles, Lieutenant Hugh O'Farrell of 2nd Armoured Division's Combat Command briefs his Sherman tank crews with brutal honesty. They have better tanks, he says, gesturing at intelligence photos of Panthers and Panzer IVs. Their gun will kill you from ranges where we can't touch them. Their armor laughs at our 75. In a fair fight, one-on-one, they win every time. He pauses, lets that sink in, watches the fear flicker across young faces. So we don't fight fair. We use numbers, mobility, and the fact that they're out of fuel. 3 of our tanks attack one of theirs from different angles simultaneously. They can't traverse fast enough to engage all of us. 1 dies, maybe 2. The 3rd kills the Panther. That's the math. That's how we win. It's a cold equation that reduces men to chess pieces. But O'Farrell learned in North Africa that soldiers prefer honest brutality to comforting lies. The M4A3 Sherman tank represents American industrial philosophy in steel form. It weighs 33.7 metric tons, mounts a 75mm M3 gun that can penetrate 60mm of armor at 1,000 meters, and features frontal armor of only 51mm vertical. By every metric of protection and firepower, it's inferior to the Panther. But the Sherman has advantages that matter more than technical specifications. It's mechanically reliable, easy to maintain, simple to produce in vast numbers, and crucially, fuel efficient. The Ford GAA engine consumes roughly 1.3 liters per kilometer on roads, nearly half the Panther's consumption. This means Sherman crews can maneuver, flank, reposition, while German tanks become increasingly static. War isn't decided by which tank has the better gun, it's decided by which tank can still move when the shooting starts. Terrain at Sells negates German technical advantages with brutal completeness. The village sits in rolling countryside cut by small streams, dotted with stone farmhouses, crisscrossed by sunken roads with 3-meter embankments. Engagement ranges that should favor German guns collapse to 200 meters or less. Panthers designed to kill at 2,000 meters find themselves in knife fights where American Shermans can penetrate their thinner side armor. The sunken roads that should provide covered approaches instead become traps. Panther tanks, with their forward-mounted transmissions and limited gun depression, cannot depress their guns enough to engage targets in the roads below when positioned on embankments. And the frozen ground prevents digging in, while the lack of fuel prevents repositioning. German tankers at Sells face the nightmare scenario, their training never adequately addressed, superior equipment rendered useless by circumstances it cannot control. American tactical doctrine evolves in real time during the Ardennes fighting. Sherman crews, having faced Panthers and Tigers since Normandy, develop techniques that contradict official training but work in practice. Hold-down positions using terrain for protection, refusing frontal engagements beyond 400 meters, coordinated attacks where multiple Shermans engage single German tanks simultaneously, accepting casualties to guarantee kills, use of high-explosive shells against vision ports and tracks rather than attempting armor penetration, and crucially, willingness to bypass German armor rather than fight it head-on, leaving isolated tanks for infantry and artillery while exploiting mobility advantages. These adaptations acknowledge American technical inferiority while leveraging American material superiority. It's the difference between an army that must preserve scarce vehicles and an army that can afford losses because replacement tanks arrive weekly. The mathematics of armor penetration tell only part of the combat story. Müller, the German gunner, knows that his KK-42 can destroy a Sherman from any angle at combat ranges, but knowing you can kill the enemy doesn't help when you cannot see him. Visibility from inside a buttoned-up tank is severely limited. The gunner peers through a telescopic sight, with perhaps 8-degree field of view. The commander has a cupola with vision blocks providing fragmentary peripheral vision. Everything else is armored blindness. American combined arms doctrine compensates for technical disadvantage through coordination. Infantry spots for tanks. Tanks provide fire support for infantry. Artillery suppresses German positions while armor maneuvers. The Sherman may be inferior to the Panther, but Sherman crews rarely fight alone. German tankers at Sellers, isolated from supporting infantry and artillery, discover that technical superiority becomes irrelevant when you're blind, immobile, and surrounded. December 25th afternoon. The fog that blanketed Selles for 2 days finally lifts. German tank crews, accustomed to weather protecting them from Allied air superiority, watch with sinking dread as the sky clears. Within hours, P-47 Thunderbolts from 9th Tactical Air Command peer overhead, their radial engines creating a distinctive buzz that veterans call the sound of American industry. The fighter bombers carry 500-pound bombs, high-velocity rockets, and 50-caliber machine guns. They don't need to destroy tanks directly. They suppress infantry support, destroy supply vehicles, force German troops to remain buttoned up and immobile, and they signal to everyone watching that American material superiority isn't just tanks and fuel. It's the ability to bring overwhelming force from every dimension simultaneously. The ordnance reports compiled after the battle reveal patterns that technical specifications obscure. American losses on December 25th and 26th totaled 28 Sherman tanks destroyed, 42 damaged but recoverable. German losses in the same period, approximately 45 to 50 tanks destroyed or abandoned, fewer than 10 damaged but recoverable. The disparity isn't explained by armor penetration or gun performance. It's explained by mobility. American tanks that were hit could be recovered, repaired, and returned to service because Allied forces controlled the battlefield. German tanks, even when only lightly damaged, had to be abandoned because there was no fuel to move them and no recovery capability to retrieve them. The battlefield at cells filled with operational Panthers that simply stopped moving, their crews setting demolition charges before surrendering rather than let intact vehicles fall to the enemy. Inside both American and German tanks, the experience of combat transcends technical discussion. Its noise beyond description, the clang of impacts against armor, the concussion of your own gun firing in confined space, the screaming of the radio as crews coordinate or cry for help. It's fear so overwhelming that men lose control of bodily functions and keep fighting anyway. It's split-second decisions about firing solutions and target priorities made by 20-year-olds who were civilians 2 years ago. The technical superiority of the Panther gun doesn't matter to the loader frantically trying to manhandle 30-kilogram shells into the breach, while the tank rocks from impacts. The armor thickness doesn't matter to the driver, listening to machine gun fire ricochet off the hull and wondering if the next round will be armor-piercing. War reduces technical excellence to survival instinct. The German response to American numerical and logistical superiority reveals both ingenuity and desperation. Crews begin using destroyed tanks as fixed fortifications, removing usable guns from immobilized Panthers and mounting them in prepared positions. A Panther turret with operational gun, but immobile hull can still achieve kills against careless Sherman crews. German tankers create interlocking fields of fire, compensating for inability to maneuver with careful positioning. They husband ammunition carefully, refusing to fire at ranges beyond certain kill probability. These are the tactics of defense, not offense, of an army trying to make every shot count, because there won't be resupply. American after-action reports note with grudging respect that German crews continued fighting effectively even when tactically defeated, imposing casualties on attackers right up until ammunition ran out, or the position became untenable. The technical comparison between Sherman and Panther ultimately matters less than the strategic context enabling each tank's employment. Germany in December 1944 builds perhaps 250 Panthers per month, straining industrial capacity while Allied bombing disrupts production and raw material access. The United States in the same period produces over 1,000 Shermans monthly, from factories operating 3 shifts, supplied by resources from across the hemisphere, shipped in convoys protected by naval superiority. Germany trains replacement Panther crews in 3 weeks, because there isn't time for more. The United States trains Sherman crews for 6 months because it can afford the investment. These disparities, invisible at tactical level, determine strategic outcomes more surely than armor angles and gun penetration. At Cells, the mathematical reality of logistics defeats the technical reality of engineering. German tanks are superior in design, firepower, and protection, but they're immobile from fuel exhaustion, isolated from support, facing numerical odds approaching 7-1 at points of contact. American tanks are inferior in design, vulnerable in combat, dependent on numerical superiority, but they can maneuver, receive resupply, replace losses, and maintain offensive action. The Panther at Cells might kill 3 Shermans before dying, but the American division has 300 Shermans, and the German Kampfgruppe has 40. This is how wars are actually decided, not by technical excellence, but by the ability to sustain combat operations while the enemy cannot. The equations are simple. The human cost of proving them is anything but. The tankers on both sides, huddled in their steel coffins at Cells, understand these realities better than any historian analyzing the battle from comfortable distance. They know that technical specifications mean nothing when you're out of ammunition. They know that armor thickness doesn't matter when artillery lands directly on top of your vehicle. They know that training and skill and courage can delay defeat, but cannot prevent it when the fundamental arithmetic of war runs against you. And they know, though few will admit it openly, that they're pawns in larger games, that their deaths will be reduced to statistics in reports, that the tanks they fought so hard to master and maintain will be scrapped or sit in museums, where schoolchildren will never understand what it felt like to be inside them when the shooting started. Iron mathematics care nothing for the men doing the calculations. The battle at Cells proves equations written in steel and blood, solved by young men who never wanted to be mathematicians. December 24th, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning. At 7th Corps Headquarters in Chauffoun 10, Belgium, Major General Joseph Lawton Collins receives an intelligence briefing that transforms confusion into clarity. The map on his wall, covered with grease pencil marks and pin flags, shows German penetrations everyone has been tracking for 8 days. But the latest aerial reconnaissance photos reveal something nobody predicted. 2nd Panzer Division has advanced beyond all other German units, creating a salient that looks less like a breakthrough and more like a noose waiting to tighten. Collins, nicknamed Lightning Joe for his aggressive combat style in the Pacific, sees opportunity where others see crisis. They've driven themselves into a sack, he tells his staff. Now we tie the knot before they realize they're trapped. The command structure of Allied forces in late December 1944 is complicated by necessity and pride. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, recognizing that the German offensive split American forces into 2 groups with no direct communication, temporarily placed all Allied units north of the Bulge under British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group Command. This decision, operationally sound, but politically inflammatory, sparked resentment among American commanders who disliked taking orders from the cautious, methodical Montgomery. But at Cells, Montgomery's command authority enables unified response. He has operational control of American 2nd Armored Division, British 30th Corps, and supporting units. For once, national pride takes secondary position to tactical necessity. The Germans are vulnerable. Kill them before they escape. The intelligence picture that emerges on December 24th combines technical sophistication with old-fashioned signal interception. Ultra decrypts, the crown jewel of Allied intelligence derived from breaking German Enigma codes, provide strategic context showing German fuel shortages and failed resupply efforts. Tactical signal intelligence. American and British radio operators listening to German communications reveals desperate requests for fuel and ammunition that go unfulfilled. Aerial reconnaissance confirms what intercepts suggest: the German column is strung out, static, vulnerable. And prisoner interrogations provide ground truth about morale, supplies, and unit dispositions. This intelligence fusion gives Allied commanders something they've lacked throughout the Ardennes fighting: complete understanding of enemy weakness at the exact moment they can exploit it. Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding 2nd Armored Division, receives his orders with the grim satisfaction of a professional recognizing the moment his training prepared him for. His division, officially in reserve for the planned spring offensive into Germany, suddenly becomes the primary American striking force in the Ardennes. The organization is standard for American armored divisions, 3 combat commands, CCA, CCB, and Reserve Combat Command, each combining tanks, armored infantry, engineers, and artillery into balanced combined arms teams. Total strength approximately 14,000 men, 390 tanks, substantial artillery, and most critically, adequate fuel stocks and supply lines. Harmon's reputation, built fighting across North Africa and Europe, rests on aggressive action and tactical flexibility. Montgomery's orders play to these strengths: attack immediately, destroy the German spearhead, accept risks to achieve speed. The coordination meeting at 1st Army Headquarters brings together officers who normally operate independently: American Corps commanders, British liaison officers, intelligence analysts, logistics coordinators, and air support representatives crowd around maps, trying to orchestrate a response that exploits every advantage while German confusion persists. The plan that emerges reflects combined arms doctrine at its finest. 2nd Armored Division attacks from 3 directions simultaneously, preventing German concentration of defense. British 30th Corps establishes blocking positions along the Meuse River, ensuring no German forces escape westward. Artillery positions coordinate to mass fires on German supply routes. Fighter bombers, weather permitting, will strike German columns during daylight. It's not a brilliant plan, it's a simple plan, executed with overwhelming force, which in warfare is often more effective than brilliance. The American response time from initial contact reports to full divisional assault is remarkably fast by any standard. First reports of German armor near Celles arrive December 23rd morning. By December 25th, less than 48 hours later, 2nd Armored Division launches coordinated, 3-pronged attack with over 200 tanks. This speed reflects both American logistical capability and command culture, emphasizing initiative. German doctrine, for all its tactical excellence, operates through rigid command hierarchies, requiring approval from higher headquarters for major decisions. American doctrine pushes decision-making to lower levels, allowing junior officers to act on opportunities without waiting for permission. At Celles, this cultural difference translates into Americans achieving surprise against Germans who are still waiting for orders from division headquarters that has lost radio contact with forward units. The strategic context makes the Battle of Celles more significant than local tactical engagement. If 2nd Panzer Division crosses the Meuse River, if they establish even a small bridgehead on the western bank, the entire Allied position in Belgium collapses. 25 divisions, roughly 250,000 men, face potential encirclement. Supply lines running through Lille and Antwerp become vulnerable. The carefully planned spring offensive into Germany, scheduled to begin in February, gets delayed months or cancelled entirely. Allied losses in such a scenario, though impossible to calculate precisely, could exceed 50,000 casualties and massive equipment losses. This is why Collins, Montgomery, and Eisenhower authorize accepting heavy casualties to prevent German success. The tactical risks are enormous. The strategic alternative is catastrophic. December 24th afternoon. 2nd Armored Division's Combat Command A begins moving toward assembly areas near Ciney, approaching Celles from the northwest. Combat Command B advances through Buissonville, approaching from the west. Reserve Combat Command moves up from Rochefort, positioning southwest of the German salient. Each combat command consists of roughly 4,000 men, 100 tanks, supporting artillery, and armored infantry. The movement isn't subtle. Hundreds of tanks create dust clouds visible for kilometers, engine noise audible for miles, radio traffic spiking as units coordinate. Under normal circumstances, such obvious preparation would alert the enemy and allow defensive response. But German reconnaissance is grounded by weather, their radio intercept capability overwhelmed, and their command structure so focused on advance that defensive preparation comes as afterthought. The Americans are driving toward Celles in broad daylight, and the Germans don't realize until it's too late. British involvement in the Celles operation often gets overlooked in American accounts, but it's essential to German defeat. 30th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, deploys along the Meuse River from Dinant to Liège, creating a defensive line that prevents any German breakthrough westward. The 29th Armored Brigade positions tanks at bridges and fording sites. Infantry divisions dig in at crossing points. Engineers prepare bridges for demolition if German armor approaches. This defensive screen doesn't fight at Celles directly, but it creates the anvil against which American armor swings the hammer. German commanders, seeing British positions solidifying, recognize that even if they defeat the American attack, there's nowhere left to advance. The Meuse River, tantalizingly close, becomes psychologically devastating. Victory sits 8 kilometers away but might as well be 800. The timing of the Allied response nearly fails because of the single factor neither side controls: weather. Dense fog blanketing the Ardennes on December 23rd and 24th grounds Allied aircraft prevents aerial reconnaissance from updating positions in real time and creates navigation challenges for ground units trying to concentrate in unfamiliar territory. American tank columns occasionally take wrong turns in the fog, end up lost, have to backtrack and find correct routes while maintaining radio silence to avoid alerting the Germans. Staff officers at 2nd Armored Division headquarters spend sleepless nights worrying that German forces will escape before the attack launches. What they don't know, can't know without signals intelligence revealing German fuel shortages, is that the enemy isn't capable of escaping. The fog that delays American attack also traps German defenders. Both sides move partially blind, making decisions on fragmentary information, hoping circumstances favor their intentions. The human element of command decisions rarely appears in operational histories. Collins, ordering the attack, knows that American casualties will likely exceed 500 killed and wounded. He signs orders sending men to their deaths with full understanding of the cost. Harman, briefing his combat command leaders, sees the fear and determination in their faces, knows that some of them won't survive the next 72 hours, continues anyway because the mission requires it. Junior officers receiving orders to advance toward German positions swallow their anxiety and speak confidently to the men who depend on them. This is the weight of command at every level, making choices that guarantee some subordinates die while hoping your decision achieves enough to justify their sacrifice. There's no glory in this calculation, no excitement, just the cold professional necessity of violence directed toward military objectives. Montgomery's involvement in the Celles operation later becomes controversial, when he claims credit for saving the Americans during the Ardennes fighting. The reality is more nuanced. His temporary command of Allied forces north of the Bulge enabled unified response, but American divisions did the fighting and dying. His methodical approach frustrated aggressive American commanders, but also prevented piecemeal counterattacks that might have failed. At Selles specifically, British defensive positions played a crucial supporting role, but 2nd Armoured Division carried the offensive burden. The argument over who deserves credit obscures the collaborative nature of the victory. Multiple national forces, coordinating through imperfect command structures, achieved success that neither could have managed independently. This is coalition warfare at its functional best, national rivalries sublimated to collective necessity. The moment of decision comes not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulation of evidence. Intelligence officers compile reports from multiple sources and realize the German spearhead is vulnerable. Commanders examine maps and recognize that American armor can reach Selles before German reinforcements. Logistics officers confirm adequate fuel and ammunition stocks for sustained operations. Weather forecasters predict clearing conditions enabling air support. All these factors align during the afternoon of December 24th, creating a window of opportunity that will close if not exploited immediately. This is the hinge point, the moment when Allied confusion transforms into coordinated action, when German success becomes German vulnerability, when the initiative shifts permanently. Nobody involved understands the historical significance. They just know they finally have clear orders, adequate resources, and an enemy they can reach. The rest is execution. Christmas morning, 1944, 6:30 a.m. The first shells scream overhead before most soldiers at Selles finish their cold rations. 48 M7 Priest self-propelled guns from 2nd Armoured Division's artillery battalions open fire simultaneously, bracketing German positions around Selles, Konzu, and Fort Meuse, Notre Dame, with high explosive. The sound is apocalyptic, rolling thunder that drowns out thought. Shock waves rippling through frozen ground. Air pressure changes, making ears pop and hearts stutter. In cellars beneath Selles village, Belgian civilians clutch children and pray while their houses shake apart overhead. In hastily dug German positions, soldiers press themselves into frozen earth and understand that the attack they've dreaded has finally begun. And advancing through morning fog, hull down behind ridgelines, American Sherman tanks begin their final approach toward combat that will decide the farthest advance of Hitler's last Western offensive. Inside Panther tank number 317, parked in Selles village center, with fuel tanks reading empty, un turo fisier, Klaus Weber sees American tanks appear through the fog, like ghosts solidifying into steel. His position gives excellent fields of fire across open ground to the northwest, but there's no possibility of maneuver. The Panther hasn't moved in 18 hours, won't move again without fuel that isn't coming. Weber counts enemy tanks 3, 5, 7, more appearing behind them. His commander, shouting over the thunder of artillery, calls out ranges and firing solutions. 1100 meters, moving right to left, lead target. Weber traverses the turret, centers the crosshairs, waits for authorization to fire. The moment stretches into eternity. Then fire. The 75mm KKV 42 gun recoils. The interior fills with smoke and cordite stench. And 1100 meters away, an American Sherman explodes into flame. 1 kill, 11 armor-piercing rounds remaining. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh O'Farrell, commanding Task Force O'Farrell of Combat Command A, watches 2 of his Shermans burn and forces himself to think tactically rather than emotionally. The German position in Sells village is killing ground, perfectly sited to cover approaches from the northwest. Frontal assault will cost dozens of tanks. So O'Farrell does what German tactical doctrine isn't designed to counter. He splits his force, sends one platoon right, one platoon left, keeps the center pinned down with suppressive fire. The Germans can't engage three directions simultaneously, not when they're immobile. It's the squad tactics he learned at Fort Knox scaled up to company level, trading American lives for German positions because that's the mathematics of material warfare. 3 Shermans die buying position for 12 others. It's horrible arithmetic, but it works. American armored infantry from the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment dismounts from M3 half-tracks, 500 meters behind the tank assault. These soldiers, riding in vehicles with armor, barely adequate to stop rifle bullets, face different terror than tankers. They're exposed, vulnerable, moving on foot through fields that might conceal mines or defensive positions. Squad leaders shout orders that get swallowed by artillery noise. Men spread into skirmish lines, maintain intervals that balance mutual support against concentration of targets. They advance towards Sells carrying M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, bazookas for anti-tank work, and determination that exceeds their protection. Infantry clears what tanks cannot, fights house to house, takes casualties that never make headlines. This is the forgotten half of armored warfare, the men on foot who turn breakthrough into exploitation. The convergence at Sells unfolds from 3 directions simultaneously, overwhelming German defensive capacity through geographical mathematics. Combat Command A attacks from Seeney in the northwest, driving toward Kunju. Combat Command B advances from Bay-Sunville in the west, targeting Sells directly. Reserve Combat Command moves up from Rochefort in the southwest, cutting the Sells-Rochefort road that represents the German line of retreat. Each combat command coordinates movement through radio nets, connecting battalion commanders to division headquarters, enabling responsive adjustment as tactical situations develop. This is combined arms warfare, functioning as designed, multiple mutually supporting attacks, creating dilemmas that defensive forces cannot solve, forcing choices between bad options until the position becomes untenable. At 11:30 Christmas morning, the fog that protected German positions for 2 days lifts like a curtain rising on tragedy. Visibility increases from 100 meters to 5 kilometers in 20 minutes. And with clear skies come the fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, from 9th Tactical Air Command's 48th Fighter Group, appear over Sells in flights of 4, orbiting at 3,000 meters, while forward air controllers with American armor radio target coordinates. The Thunderbolts dive, releasing 500-pound bombs, firing high-velocity aerial rockets, strafing with 50-caliber machine guns that make tank armor ring like cathedral bells. German soldiers, accustomed to weather protecting them from air attack, discover what American material superiority means when unrestrained. You can't hide from aircraft when there's no cloud cover. You can't fight back with small arms. You just endure and hope the bombs land somewhere else. Inside Panther 317, Weber watches his ammunition count drop with each engagement. 8 rounds remaining. 6. 4. Each shot must count, because there won't be resupply. The American attack adjusts to his firing solutions, tanks using terrain for cover, refusing to present clean shots at ranges where his gun holds overwhelming advantage. They're learning, adapting, forcing him to take difficult shots against partially concealed targets at 600 meters instead of easy kills at 1,000. His kill count rises, 3 Shermans confirmed, 1 probable. But American numbers rise faster. For every Sherman he destroys, 2 more appear. The mathematics are inexorable. He can kill 5, 10, 15 Americans. They can afford the loss. He cannot afford to miss. The human experience of combat at Sels transcends tactical description. It's fear so complete that rational thought becomes impossible. Instinct and training carrying men through actions they'll barely remember afterward. It's the tank driver watching tracers bounce off his glacis plate and calculating whether the next round will penetrate. It's the infantry sergeant dragging a wounded private into cover, while machine gun fire kicks up frozen dirt around them. It's the artillery forward observer, safe in a command post 3 kilometers back, calling fire missions on map coordinates that represent living men about to die. Combat is simultaneous boredom and terror, waiting punctuated by violence so intense that minutes feel like hours, measured in heartbeats and ammunition counts. December 25th afternoon. The 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion, operating as Combat Command B's screening force, cuts the Sels-Rochefort road at multiple points. Light tanks and armoured cars position on high ground overlooking the road, creating interlocking fields of fire that make resupply or retreat impossible. German vehicles attempting to reach Sels face choices between turning back or dying. Most turn back. The pocket is now completely sealed. 2nd Panzer Division's forward elements hold approximately 8 kilometers of perimeter, with no supply line, no reinforcement capability, and no authorization to withdraw. Inside the pocket, roughly 40 operational tanks, 1,200 infantry, declining ammunition, and the growing understanding that they're fighting a losing battle for objectives that no longer matter. The radio traffic between American units, later transcribed from recordings, reveals the evolution of a battle from confusion to control. Early transmissions show uncertainty. Contact with enemy armor, unknown strength, taking fire from village center. Middle period traffic reflects adaptation, flanking movement successful, engaging from 360 degrees, suppressive fire on primary position. Late period communications demonstrate dominance, objective secured, 14 enemy tanks destroyed, infantry clearing buildings, moving to next phase line. This progression from chaos to order represents professional military organizations learning faster than their enemies, incorporating lessons in real time, exploiting advantages as they emerge. The Germans at Sels fight as well as training and circumstances permit, but they're reacting to American initiative rather than imposing their own will, always one step behind the tactical timeline. Belgian civilians in Sels experience Christmas 1944 as hell manifested. The village that changed hands between French and German control for centuries, that survived medieval sieges and Napoleonic warfare, suffers destruction beyond anything in its history. Artillery shells crash through roofs and detonate in living rooms. Tank fire sets timber frame houses ablaze, streets fill with rubble, and the bodies of soldiers from both sides. Families huddled in cellars listen to men dying overhead, German and American voices shouting in languages the civilians barely comprehend, united only in their expression of pain. When American infantry finally clears the village house by house, they find terrified families who've been trapped for 4 days without adequate food, water, or heat. Liberation for these civilians means survival, but also trauma that will echo through generations. The aerial perspective of the battle, recorded by gun cameras on P-47s and documented by reconnaissance aircraft, shows scale invisible to participants. The German column stretches from Celles back to Rochefort, a distance of approximately 15 kilometers, visible as dark lines on snow-covered landscape. Destroyed and abandoned vehicles mark the route like a trail of dying organism. Secondary explosions from ammunition trucks create black smoke plumes rising hundreds of meters. American tank columns converge from three directions, their movement coordinated but still recognizable as chaos organized toward purpose. One pilot, interviewed decades later, described it as watching ants swarm something larger than themselves, overwhelming through numbers and persistence rather than strength. It's an apt metaphor for the entire American strategic approach. Material superiority overwhelming technical excellence through sheer mass. By 1800 hours Christmas Day, the first phase of the Battle of Selles reaches conclusion. American forces control Conjou, have penetrated Selles village center, and cut all German supply routes. Casualty reports begin filtering to division headquarters. 28 American tanks destroyed, 42 damaged, approximately 150 killed and wounded. German losses estimated at 45 to 50 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 300 to 400 casualties. The mathematics favor the Americans, despite German tanks maintaining positive kill ratios when engaged. But battles aren't decided by exchange rates. They're decided by who controls the battlefield when fighting stops, who can replace losses, who can continue operations tomorrow. By every meaningful metric, the Americans are winning, the Germans are dying. As Christmas night falls over Selles, the fighting subsides into sporadic exchanges and exhausted positioning. German survivors consolidate into smaller perimeters, organize defensive fires, face the reality that relief isn't coming. American units dig in, establish security, bring forward supplies for continued operations tomorrow. Medics on both sides work through the night, treating wounded, sorting those who might survive from those beyond help, making choices that will haunt them for lifetimes. And in the frozen fields between positions, in the burning village, in the wreckage of tanks that were technological marvels and are now steel coffins, lie the bodies of young men who woke up this morning alive and went to sleep dead. Christmas 1944 at Selles offers no peace, no goodwill, no comfort. Just the convergence of forces that mathematics predicted, logistics enabled, and men paid for in blood. December 26, 1944, 4 o'clock in the morning. Darkness still covers Selles when 7 Panther tanks from Fistyway, Notre Dame, attempt a desperate counterattack southward. These are the last operational German tanks, with enough fuel for maneuver, commanded by officers who understand that passivity equals death. The attack catches American positions partially unprepared, Panthers emerging from morning fog like prehistoric predators, their engines roaring in the pre-dawn silence. 2 American Shermans explode before crews realize they're under attack. For 15 minutes, the German counterattack opens a corridor through American lines, creating the possibility of escape for trapped forces. Then American reinforcements arrive from 3 directions, and mathematics reasserts itself. 7 Panthers cannot hold against 30 Shermans. The corridor closes, 3 German tanks burn, 4 retreat to Foy Notre Dame, with fuel gauges reading empty. The last German offensive action at Selles ends where it began, achieving nothing except proving that courage without logistics is just another word for dying slowly. The American tactical adaptation to German technical superiority reaches full sophistication during December 26th fighting. Sherman platoons abandon conventional doctrine entirely, adopting what tankers call swarm tactics. 5 tanks identify a single immobilized Panther, coordinate over radio, attack simultaneously from different angles. The German gunner can only engage 1 target at a time. Traverse rates, even on the excellent Panther design, limit engagement speed. While the German crew fights 1 American tank, 3 others maneuver for flank shots. The mathematics are brutal and effective. The American platoon loses 3 Shermans, the Panther dies. Unit commanders accept these exchange rates because division headquarters can replace 3 Shermans within 48 hours. Germany cannot replace that Panther for months, if ever. This is industrial warfare distilled to essential truth. The side that can absorb losses and continue fighting wins, regardless of tactical excellence. At 10 o'clock Christmas morning, the weather shifts permanently in Allied favor. The high-pressure system that brought fog and low clouds to the Ardennes breaks apart, replaced by cold, clear conditions with unlimited visibility. 9th Tactical Air Command launches 289 sorties against the Sellers Pocket over December 25th and 26th, the largest concentration of close air support in the Ardennes campaign. P-47 Thunderbolts carry 500-pound bombs that create craters 10 meters across. High-velocity aerial rockets penetrate light armor and destroy trucks, half-tracks, supply vehicles, and 50-caliber machine gun fire, 6 guns per aircraft firing 3,000 rounds per minute collectively, turns any exposed German infantry into casualties. Pilots later claim 71 armored vehicles destroyed or damaged, 83 soft-skin vehicles destroyed. These numbers, like most aerial claims, are inflated, but the psychological impact is real. German soldiers at Sellers cannot move during daylight without inviting death from above. The experience of being on the receiving end of air attack, described by German survivors in post-war interviews, transcends tactical description. Its helplessness absolute and terrifying. You hear the aircraft engines, high-pitched screams growing louder. You see the thunderbolts diving, growing larger, impossibly fast. You know bombs or rockets are coming, but have no way to influence whether they hit your position. You press yourself into whatever cover exists and wait to discover if you'll survive the next 10 seconds. Some men break under this pressure, abandoning positions to flee toward any cover. Some freeze entirely, paralyzed by fear. Some develop fatalistic calm, recognizing that survival or death is random chance beyond their control. But nobody adapts to it. Nobody becomes comfortable with air attack. It just accumulates as psychological trauma layered upon physical exhaustion until human breaking points arrive unexpectedly and completely. December 26th afternoon. American infantry from the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment begins house-to-house clearing operations in Sellers village center. This is warfare stripped of technological advantage, reduced to rifles and grenades, and men killing each other at ranges where you can see faces. Each house must be approached cautiously, checked for booby traps, cleared room by room. German defenders, knowing retreat is impossible and surrender shameful, fight from cellars and upper floors, extracting maximum casualties before being killed or overwhelmed. American squad leaders learn quickly that German defensive positions follow patterns: machine guns covering approaches, rifle teams in buildings providing supporting fire, pan-zer Fausts for anti-tank work hidden near likely tank avenues. Learning these patterns keeps you alive. Failing to learn them makes you a casualty statistic. The temporary ceasefire on December 26th afternoon reveals war's complicated humanity. A German infantry lieutenant, responsible for 60 wounded soldiers with no medical supplies, approaches American lines under white flag. The shooting stops. American and German officers meet in the middle of a frozen field, communicate through a Belgian civilian who speaks both languages. The German requests medical assistance for wounded who will die without treatment. The American lieutenant, a dentist from Ohio in civilian life, agrees to temporary ceasefire for casualty evacuation. For 2 hours, American medics help German wounded while soldiers from both sides watch warily, weapons ready but not aimed. Then the wounded are evacuated. The German officer salutes, returns to his lines, and shooting resumes. This moment of humanity changes nothing strategically, but for the men who participated, it complicates the narrative that enemy soldiers are inhuman monsters. They're just men, wounded and dying, as terrified and confused as anyone else. The destruction of German supply columns behind Sellers transforms tactical defeat into catastrophic loss. American fighter bombers and artillery systematically destroy everything moving on roads between Sellers and Rochefort. Ammunition trucks explode in secondary detonations visible 30 kilometers away. Fuel tankers burn with black smoke that marks killing grounds for follow-up strikes. Medical half-tracks carrying wounded, technically protected under Geneva Conventions, but unmarked and indistinguishable from military vehicles, get hit by rockets and bombs. The pilots see valid military targets. The German wounded inside see war crimes. Both perspectives are simultaneously true and useless. This is what happens when industrial-scale violence meets inadequate protective frameworks. The laws of war, carefully written in peacetime, dissolve into irrelevance when 19-year-old pilots make identification decisions at 500 kilometers per hour. Inside the shrinking German perimeter, the psychological collapse precedes the tactical defeat. Radio operators intercept increasingly desperate messages between German units and division headquarters. Encircled, no ammunition, request permission to break out. Fuel exhausted, cannot maneuver, require immediate resupply. Heavy casualties, position untenable, request withdrawal authorization. The responses from German High Command reveal the disconnect between operational reality and ideological fantasy. Relief column en route, maintain perimeter. No retreat authorized, fight to last man if necessary. These orders, written by officers safe in rear area headquarters, sentence men to death for objectives already lost. Junior officers at Sellers face impossible choices: obey orders that guarantee their men die slowly, or disobey and face court-martial for cowardice. Most obey because military discipline is stronger than survival instinct. Some don't, and their decisions haunt them forever. The American casualty count rises steadily, despite tactical advantage. 28 tanks destroyed becomes 35, then 42. 150 killed and wounded becomes 200, then 250. Each number represents a specific human being. Private James McKinley, from the 84th Division, killed by artillery fire on December 26th. Lieutenant Hugh Brennan, 2nd Armored Division, bled out in a burning Sherman before medics could reach him. Sergeant Robert Hayes, 41st Armored Infantry, shot by a German sniper while leading his squad through Sellers village. The tactical victory at Sellers costs American families their sons, wives their husbands, children their fathers. Military historians focus on operational success, but for those families, the victory is permanent loss wrapped in medals and condolence letters that change nothing. German infantry at Sells, increasingly isolated from their armor as tanks run out of ammunition or get destroyed, face choices that echo through post-war memory. Small groups attempt breakout at night, crawling through American lines, hoping to reach German positions 20 kilometers east. Some succeed, navigating by stars and desperation, surviving on adrenaline until they stagger into friendly territory days later. Most get caught by American patrols or trip wire-activated flares that illuminate them for machine gun fire. And some refuse to run, organizing last-ditch defensive positions in farmhouses and cellars, fighting until killed or ammunition runs out. These are the men who believe retreat is betrayal, who internalized propaganda about fighting for Germany's survival, who cannot reconcile surrender with their identity as soldiers. American infantry clearing these positions find letters from home, photographs of children, personal effects that humanize the enemy uncomfortably. The tactical innovations developed at Sellies become doctrine for American armored forces for the remainder of the war. Hold down firing positions using terrain for protection, refusing to engage German heavy armor frontally beyond 400 meters. Coordinated platoon attacks against single enemy vehicles, integration of air support through forward air controllers, combined arms coordination where infantry, armor, and artillery operate as single organism rather than separate components. These lessons, purchased with lives at Sellies, save lives in subsequent battles across Germany. But the men who developed these tactics through trial and error, who watch their friends die learning what works, receive no recognition beyond after-action reports that reduce their sacrifice to bullet points about tactical effectiveness. December 26th evening. The 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion reports final severing of all routes into the Sellies pocket. German forces inside the perimeter now have zero possibility of resupply, reinforcement, or retreat. They hold approximately 6 square kilometers with declining ammunition, immobilized armor, and casualties mounting hourly. American artillery continues firing throughout the night, harassing fire designed to prevent rest and demoralize defenders. German radio transmissions, intercepted and translated, show the psychological impact. Soldiers request permission to surrender. Junior officers plead for withdrawal authorization. And from German division headquarters, silence. The army that once conquered Europe in months now abandons its forward units to destruction because ideology cannot admit defeat. This is how totalitarian systems destroy their own military, not through enemy action alone, but through refusal to accept ground truth when it contradicts preferred narrative. The killing ground at Sels on December 26th night is frozen earth covered with snow turned pink from blood that won't stop flowing. Destroyed tanks burn or sit silent, their crews dead inside or fled on foot. Buildings collapse into rubble from artillery impacts and tank fire. The dead lie where they fell, American and German bodies mixed together in grotesque democracy, frozen in position suggesting their final moments. Medics work through darkness treating wounded, performing triage by flashlight, making choices about who gets limited morphine supplies. And soldiers on both sides, exhausted beyond human endurance, try to sleep in positions where sleep means vulnerability, but staying awake means collapse. This is the reality behind operational success and tactical victory. Young men destroying each other for objectives most barely understand, accumulating trauma that will echo through lifetimes, fighting wars that generals plan but soldiers pay for. The killing ground at Sels doesn't care about strategy or doctrine or historical significance. It just keeps taking lives and creating ghosts. December 24th, 1944, evening. At Supreme Command West Headquarters in T.C. Genberg, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stares at situation maps that show 2nd Panzer Division's exposed position at Sels with the expression of a man watching catastrophe unfold in slow motion. Von Rundstedt, 70 years old, veteran of both world wars, one of Germany's most respected military minds, understands tactical reality better than the ideologues at Führer headquarters. The spearhead is isolated, vulnerable, dying. Without immediate reinforcement, 2nd Panzer Division will be destroyed. He drafts orders for 9th Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division to advance towards Sels, attempt relief, salvage something from impending disaster. But even as he signs the orders, von Rundstedt knows they're insufficient. The reinforcements are too far away, too poorly supplied, facing too many American defensive positions. The relief that should have been organized days ago will arrive too late, if it arrives at all. 9th Panzer Division receives movement orders on Christmas morning, with less than 8 hours of daylight remaining and 60 kilometers of hostile territory to cover. This division, like most German armored formations in December 1944, exists more on paper than reality. Official strength: 12,000 men, 60 operational tanks, mixing Panthers and Panzer IVs, supporting infantry and artillery. Actual combat effectiveness: roughly 8,000 men capable of sustained operations, perhaps 45 tanks mechanically reliable enough for extended movement, and fuel stocks sufficient for maybe 80 kilometers of movement before exhaustion. The division's commander, General Major Generalmajor Harold von Elverfeldt, understands that reaching Celles requires not just covering distance, but breaking through American defensive positions that are solidifying hourly. It's an impossible mission. He orders the advance anyway, because refusing orders from von Rundstedt means court-martial and execution. The geographic reality between 9th Panzer Division's starting positions near Marche and 2nd Panzer Division's trapped spearhead at Celles represents 15 to 20 kilometers of Belgian countryside that might as well be impassable mountains. American 84th Infantry Division occupies defensive positions across the most direct routes, established in villages, at crossroads, on high ground overlooking approach routes. These aren't elite troops. The 84th is a relatively green division that only arrived in Europe in November, but they're dug in, supported by artillery, receiving intelligence about German movements and fighting defensively rather than attacking across open ground. The tactical advantage shifts dramatically from mobile offense to prepared defense, and the Americans know reinforcements are coming, have positioned specifically to prevent them from reaching Celles, and can afford to trade time for casualties because time favors the Allied position. December 25th afternoon. 9th Panzer Division's lead elements encounter American defensive positions at Verden, a small village straddling the March-Chelles Road. The Germans attempt to force passage through combined arms assault, armor leading, infantry following, engineers preparing to clear obstacles. The Americans respond with everything they have: anti-tank guns firing from prepared positions, artillery falling on approach routes, infantry with bazookas targeting tanks from buildings. The battle for Verden lasts 6 hours, consumes the remaining daylight, and achieves nothing except casualties on both sides. By nightfall, 9th Panzer Division has advanced perhaps 4 kilometers, still 12 kilometers short of Celles, with fuel supplies declining and American reinforcements arriving. Von Elverfeld recognizes the arithmetic. At this rate, his division will be combat ineffective before reaching 2nd Panzer Division. But orders are orders, and totalitarian armies don't reward commanders who acknowledge reality when it contradicts ideology. Allied intelligence advantages at Celles extend far beyond tactical awareness. Ultra-intercepts, the crown jewel of British cryptanalysis, provide strategic context by decoding German high command communications. Allied intelligence officers read orders from von Rundstedt to 9th Panzer Division before some German commanders receive them. They know German fuel stocks, understand reinforcement timelines, recognize the desperation behind German operational planning. This information flows to American defensive positions within hours, enabling preemptive response. When 9th Panzer Division attacks at Verden, American forces are already positioned specifically to prevent that advance. The Germans are fighting an enemy who knows their plans better than they do. This intelligence asymmetry, combined with material superiority, makes German tactical excellence increasingly irrelevant. South of Celles, Panzer Lehr Division, attempts a complementary relief operation driving north from Rochefort toward the trapped spearhead. This division, once considered elite, has been bled white through continuous combat since Normandy. By December 1944, Panzer exists primarily as legend and organizational structure around a core of exhausted veterans and replacement troops who barely know each other. The division advances perhaps 8 kilometers before encountering Combat Command Reserve from American 2nd Armored Division and elements of British 29th Armored Brigade. The resulting engagement near Rochefort village follows predictable patterns: German tactical skill against Allied material superiority, excellent German tanks, handicapped by fuel shortages, defenders with prepared positions against attackers operating across unfamiliar ground. By December 26th evening, Panzer has suffered 30% casualties, lost 15 tanks, and advanced nowhere near Celles. The coordination between American and British forces preventing German relief efforts represents coalition warfare functioning effectively despite national tensions. American divisions provide mobile striking power and offensive capability. British units establish defensive depth and hold crucial terrain. Intelligence flows between commands through liaison officers who navigate personality conflicts and bureaucratic obstacles. Artillery fires are coordinated to avoid fratricide. Air support is allocated based on tactical necessity rather than national pride. This cooperation isn't natural or easy. It's the result of hard experience learning that survival requires subordinating ego to military effectiveness. The Germans at Celles face not just American 2nd Armored Division, but the accumulated weight of Allied coalition conducting modern combined arms warfare against an enemy that can no longer match their coordination. December 26. Hitler's A80 de la Horst headquarters near Bart, now him. The Führer receives situation reports showing 2nd Panzer Division encircled at Celles, 9th Panzer Division stalled short of relief objectives, Panzer making no progress. Any rational strategic assessment would recognize that the Ardennes offensive has failed, that continued attacks only waste irreplaceable forces, that withdrawal to defensible positions represents the least bad option. But Hitler's strategic vision operates from ideological conviction rather than military reality. He refuses to authorize withdrawal, insists that 2nd Panzer Division must hold regardless of casualties, demands that reinforcements fight harder to break through American positions. These orders, transmitted through command channels, sentence thousands of German soldiers to death for objectives already lost. This is totalitarian warfare at its most destructive strategy, subordinated to ideology, reality denied, when inconvenient, human lives expended to avoid admitting failure. The timeline failure dooming German relief efforts is simple arithmetic that ideology cannot overcome. Even if 9th Panzer Division broke through American defenses on December 26th, a generous assumption ignoring ground reality, they would reach Celles on December 27th at earliest. By that date, 2nd Panzer Division's forward units will have been encircled for 3 days, without resupply, under constant attack, suffering casualties that accumulate into combat ineffectiveness. The force that relief columns might rescue would be remnants, not formations capable of continued offensive action. And arriving at Celles doesn't solve the fundamental problem. Germany cannot sustain operations this far forward without logistics that don't exist. Fuel convoys that should have supplied 2nd Panzer Division never left Germany due to Allied bombing. Ammunition stocks are exhausted. Replacement troops are phantoms on organizational charts. The reinforcements that never came couldn't have changed strategic outcomes even if they arrived, because the Ardennes offensive was operationally bankrupt from conception. German command culture, shaped by decades of emphasis on aggressive offensive action and tactical excellence, proves catastrophically maladaptive when facing strategic impossibility. Junior officers at 9th Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr understand they're being sacrificed for nothing. They can see American defensive positions multiplying, watch their fuel gauges approach empty, calculate that reaching cells achieves nothing except adding their casualties to the disaster. But German military culture provides no mechanism for junior officers to refuse senseless orders. The system that produced tactical brilliance in Poland and France becomes a suicide machine when strategic circumstances shift. Officers carry out attacks they know will fail, because disobedience means execution and obedience means death with honor. This false choice, honor versus survival, destroys armies when leaders refuse to acknowledge that continuing hopeless operations doesn't demonstrate determination but guarantees destruction. The view from inside 9th Panzer Division during December 25th and 26th combines exhaustion, frustration, and dawning understanding that they're attempting the impossible. Tank crews advance, engage American positions, take casualties, advance again, accomplish nothing except consuming irreplaceable fuel and ammunition. Infantry attack across frozen fields, lose men to machine gun and artillery fire, capture villages that matter strategically not at all. Engineers try to clear obstacles under fire, see their vehicles destroyed, watch their commanders order continued attacks despite accumulating evidence of futility. And through it all runs the knowledge that comrades at cells are dying waiting for relief that isn't coming fast enough. This is perhaps the worst military experience, fighting desperately while knowing your efforts are insufficient, watching the objective recede despite maximum effort, understanding that your sacrifice changes nothing. British defensive positions along the Meuse River, the strategic backstop preventing any German breakthrough westward, never get seriously tested because German relief efforts fail so completely. 29th Armoured Brigade positions tanks at bridge sites and prepares demolition charges they won't need to use. Infantry divisions dig in along the river, expecting attacks that never materialize. And Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, commanding British 30th Corps, watches situation maps with satisfaction as American forces destroy German spearheads before they come anywhere near British positions. The British defensive line serves its purpose without firing significant shots. It creates psychological barrier confirming to German commanders that even reaching cellars accomplishes nothing because the Meuse River crossings are already lost. Sometimes the most effective military operations are the ones that don't require combat because deterrent effect alone achieves objectives. The after-action analysis of German relief efforts becomes ammunition for post-war debates about Hitler's military leadership versus professional officer competence. Some historians argue that German relief columns were never adequate, that von Rundstedt's planning was as fantastical as Hitler's strategic vision. Others contend that German divisions might have succeeded if Hitler hadn't interfered with tactical decisions, hadn't forbidden withdrawals, hadn't demanded holding untenable positions. The truth, as usual, is more complex. German relief efforts failed because of compounding factors: inadequate logistics, Allied intelligence advantages, American defensive skill, British blocking positions, weather clearing to enable air support, and yes, Hitler's refusal to authorize sensible retreats. No single factor explains the failure. All factors together create inevitable defeat that ideology refused to acknowledge until encircled men at cells paid the price. December 26 evening. At cells, surrounded German soldiers listen for the sound of relief columns that aren't coming. They strain to hear German diesel engines, watch for friendly signals, hope that reinforcements will arrive before ammunition runs completely out. Some still believe in final victory, in Germany's destiny, in the Führer's strategic genius. Most just want to survive. And the veterans, the ones who fought in Russia and North Africa, the ones who've seen this pattern before, understand with sinking certainty that they're abandoned. The reinforcements that never came represent more than tactical failure. They represent the collapse of German offensive capability, the exhaustion of resources, the inevitable conclusion of waging total war against enemies with deeper reserves. The men at Sales don't have strategic perspective to understand these implications. They just know they're alone, surrounded, running out of ammunition, and nobody is coming to save them. Sometimes understanding arrives too late to matter. December 27th, 1944, dawn. Inside Panther, tank number 317, in Sels village center. Unteroffizier Klaus Weber and his crew face a decision that will define the rest of their lives. The tank hasn't moved in 3 days, fuel tank empty, ammunition down to 2 armor-piercing rounds. American Shermans are visible in 3 directions, holding positions out of effective firing range, waiting with the patience of predators who know their prey is wounded. Weber's commander, Oberfeldwebel Weibel Ernst Hoffmann, a veteran of the Eastern Front with 2 years of combat experience, calls a crew meeting. "We can fight until we're killed," he says quietly, "or we can surrender while we're still capable of walking out." The youngest crewman, 19-year-old Karl Schmidt, starts crying. He's never surrendered before, was taught that German soldiers fight to the death, cannot reconcile capitulation with his identity as a soldier. But 2 years of war have taught Hoffmann that dead men don't go home to their families. The crew takes a vote, 4-1 for surrender. They destroy the gun breech with a hand grenade, make the Panther useless to Americans, and climb out with hands raised. The surrender process at Sels, repeated dozens of times across December 27th and 28th, reveals humanity that tactical accounts often obscure. American infantry approach German positions cautiously, weapons ready, expecting traps or last-minute resistance. What they find instead are exhausted men, most in their early 20s, frostbitten, hungry, relieved to be alive. Some German soldiers weep as they surrender, overwhelmed by shame and relief in equal measure. Others maintain rigid military bearing, surrendering with formal courtesy, as if this were peacetime maneuvers rather than the collapse of their entire offensive. American soldiers, themselves exhausted from 3 days of continuous combat, process prisoners with mixture of caution and pity. They offer cigarettes, share rations, provide blankets against the cold. These small gestures of humanity don't erase the violence or reconcile the destruction, but they acknowledge shared recognition that soldiers on both sides are victims of decisions made by commanders who won't face the consequences. Not everyone surrenders willingly. Small groups of German soldiers, particularly paratroopers and SSS units, refuse capitulation even when tactical situation is hopeless. A dozen German paratroopers occupy a destroyed farmhouse on Ciel's eastern edge, well supplied with ammunition, determined to fight until killed. American infantry surrounds the position, calls for surrender, receives rifle fire in response. The farmhouse gets hit with tank fire, artillery, white phosphorus grenades that start fires throughout the structure. The fighting lasts 40 minutes. When American soldiers finally enter the smoking ruins, they find 12 bodies, several still holding rifles, letters to families in their pockets. One letter, later translated, reads, "If you receive this, I died fighting for Germany. Tell mother I thought of her at the end. Tell her I wasn't afraid." He was 22 years old. His name was Hans Dietrich. He died for objectives already lost, fighting enemies who would have preferred he surrender. This is what ideology does to young men. Convinces them that dying pointlessly is honorable. Belgian civilians emerging from cellars after 4 days of battle find their village transformed into catastrophe. Tells a community of 200 people where everyone knew everyone has lost 60% of its buildings to destruction or severe damage. Houses that stood for centuries are rubble. The church, dating to 1200s, has its steeple destroyed by tank fire. Streets are cratered, impassable, littered with shell casings and equipment, and things civilians don't want to look at closely. 47 civilians died during the fighting, killed by artillery, caught in crossfire, crushed when buildings collapsed. Mashri Dubois, aged 63, emerges from her cellar to find her house destroyed and her adult son dead in the street, killed by shrapnel on December 26th, while trying to reach the family's hidden food stores. She doesn't cry, doesn't scream, just sits in the rubble and stares at nothing. Liberation for Belgian civilians at cells doesn't mean freedom, it means survival at unacceptable cost. The American Graves Registration Units arrive at cells on December 29th, beginning the grim work of processing battlefield casualties. These soldiers, often overlooked in combat narratives, perform essential function that combat troops cannot: identifying bodies, recovering personal effects, preparing casualties for burial, maintaining records that allow families eventual closure. At cells, they find American and German dead mixed together, frozen in positions suggesting final moments, sometimes locked in death together where close combat occurred. The Graves Registration Sergeant, a 40-year-old farmer from Iowa named Robert Henderson, writes in his diary, "They're all just kids. American, German, doesn't matter when they're dead. Too young to buy beer, old enough to die in Belgium, for reasons I don't understand. We separate them. American left, German right, like death respects national boundaries. But they died the same, scared, in pain, calling for mothers. War is old men talking and young men dying." The final casualty statistics for the Battle of Cells, compiled over weeks as after-action reports filter through command channels, tell story of tactical victory achieved through material advantage rather than battlefield brilliance. German 2nd Panzer Division losses in the cell sector: approximately 1,400 killed or wounded, 1,600 captured. Material losses: 82 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 83 artillery pieces lost, 405 other vehicles destroyed. For a division that started the Ardennes offensive with 27,000 men and 146 tanks, this represents catastrophic destruction. The division as combat-effective formation ceases to exist. American 2nd Armored Division casualties during the entire Ardennes campaign: 353 killed, 1,150 wounded, 31 missing. Cell-specific casualties estimated at 200 killed or wounded. The exchange rate favors Americans dramatically, not because of tactical brilliance, but because industrial warfare rewards the side that can sustain losses and continue operations. The prisoner of war processing reveals logistical challenges nobody anticipated. American forces at CLs capture over 1,600 German soldiers in 3 days, overwhelming detention facilities. Initial POW camps are improvised in fields near Marche, prisoners guarded by infantry squads that should be resting or training for future operations. The weather, freezing rain, and temperatures below 0 Celsius makes imprisonment nearly as dangerous as combat. German prisoners, many already suffering frostbite from fighting in inadequate winter clothing, develop exposure injuries that require medical treatment Allied logistics can barely provide. Some die in captivity from wounds sustained during battle, inadequate medical care, or exposure. These deaths, often absent from official casualty figures, represent how war's consequences extend beyond combat into the messy aftermath that histories frequently omit. December 28th evening. American soldiers walk through Sel's battlefield in fading light, seeing destruction with different perspective than combat urgency allowed. Destroyed Panther and Sherman tanks sit silent, some still burning, others already rusting monuments to wasted industrial capacity. Personal effects scattered everywhere: German helmets, American rifles, letters from homes soaked in snow and blood, photographs of wives and children who will never see their husbands and fathers alive again. Lieutenant Hugh O'Farrell, who led Task Force O'Farrell through 3 days of fighting, stands beside a destroyed Panther and reads a letter he found in the snow. It's in German, which he doesn't understand, but the photograph attached shows a young woman holding an infant. The German tanker who carried this letter is dead inside the Panther. O'Farrell puts the letter back where he found it, walks away, and doesn't speak for the rest of the evening. This is how war accumulates in human psyche, not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulation of small moments showing enemy humanity you'd prefer not to acknowledge. The question of why German soldiers fought so long for lost objectives haunts post-war analysis and veteran testimony. Some argue ideological conditioning, Nazi propaganda, and fear of punishment explain continued resistance after tactical situation became hopeless. Others emphasize military discipline, unit cohesion, and simple unwillingness to abandon comrades even when survival requires retreat. The truth varies individually. Some German soldiers at Sales were committed Nazis who believed fighting to the death served Germany's destiny. Most were just soldiers following orders because disobedience meant court-martial and surrender meant shame before comrades. And some continued fighting because exhaustion and fear made rational decision-making impossible, because combat psychology created tunnel vision focused on immediate survival rather than strategic calculation. Reducing their motivations to single explanation oversimplifies human complexity under extreme stress. The American experience processing German surrender reveals unexpected emotional complexity. Soldiers who fought desperately for 3 days find themselves face to face with enemy they were trying to kill hours before, now helpless prisoners. Some Americans feel triumph, satisfaction at defeating forces they saw as evil. Others feel pity, recognizing shared humanity in exhausted German soldiers who look more like victims than villains. And some feel nothing, emotional numbness that comes from trauma overload, inability to process continuous violence followed by sudden peace. These varied reactions don't fit neat narratives about good versus evil or righteous victory. They reflect messy reality that war damages everyone it touches, regardless of which side claims victory. The Germans at Sellers lost the battle, but examining faces of American soldiers after fighting stops reveals that victory doesn't mean wholeness. As December 28th becomes December 29th, as the last German resistance at Sels collapses into surrender or death, the battle enters historical record as tactical victory and strategic turning point. But for the men who fought there, for Belgian civilians who lost homes and family, for families across America and Germany who received telegrams about sons who won't come home, Sels is personal tragedy dressed in operational success. The liberation of Belgian villages came at cost of their destruction. The defeat of German offensive required Allied casualties that statistics reduced to acceptable percentages. The protection of strategic objectives demanded young men die in frozen fields miles from home. Military historians will analyze cells for decades, extracting lessons about armored warfare and logistics and command decisions. But the people who lived through it, who survived it, who lost pieces of themselves in the snow and rubble, understand truth that operational analysis obscures. War's costs always exceed its victories, and the young men who pay those costs deserve more than reduction to statistics in somebody else's strategic analysis. December 29th, 1944. At Allied Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight Eisenhower examines casualty reports and intelligence assessments from the Ardennes offensive with expression mixing relief and calculation. The crisis that threatened Allied strategy for 8 days has been contained, turned back, transformed into German catastrophe. The maps show German penetrations being compressed, American forces regaining lost territory, enemy formations retreating or surrendering across the entire front. Eisenhower, whose reputation was questioned during the offensive's early days, when critics suggested he'd been surprised and outmaneuvered, now presides over victory that vindicates his strategic patience. The German army in the West is finished as an offensive force, he tells his staff. It's not hyperbole. At Celles and across the Ardennes, Germany has burned through reserves it cannot replace, spent fuel it doesn't have, and destroyed divisions that existed more in organizational charts than combat reality. The tide has turned permanently. American war correspondents, kept away from frontline positions during the crisis, descend on Celles in early January 1945 to document the victory for home front consumption. They photograph destroyed German Panthers and Panzer IVs, interview American tankers who speak in carefully censored terms about the fighting, walk through Belgian villages that look like medieval paintings of hell. Ernie Pyle, the most respected war correspondent covering European theatre, writes about Celles with characteristic focus on individual soldiers rather than grand strategy. The boys who stopped the Germans at Celles aren't heroes in the Hollywood sense, he writes. They're just Americans a long way from home, doing a job they never asked for, killing men they'd probably like if they met at a bar. They won the battle. They saved Belgium. They turned back Hitler's last throw of the dice. And all most of them want is to go home and forget this ever happened. The photographs from Celles that military censors initially block reveal warfare's reality more completely than sanitized images allowed for home front publication. Destroyed tanks with crews burned inside, their bodies visible through hatches. German dead frozen in positions, suggesting they died crawling towards safety. American soldiers with 1,000-yard stares, faces showing trauma that no amount of victory celebration can erase. Belgian civilians standing in ruins of homes, expressions combining relief at survival with despair at loss. These images, kept from American newspapers until after war's end, show what tactical victory actually costs when measured in human terms rather than strategic success. The censors argue that publishing such images would damage morale, make Americans question the war's purpose, provide ammunition for enemy propaganda. They're probably right. Truth is sometimes luxury that nations at war cannot afford. January 3rd, 1945. At German Supreme Command West Headquarters, Field Marshal Walter Model receives confirmation that 2nd Panzer Division has ceased to exist as combat effective formation. The division that advanced 90 kilometers in 7 days, that came within 8 kilometers of the Meuse River, that represented Germany's deepest penetration during the entire Ardennes offensive, has been destroyed at Celles. Model, a fanatic Nazi loyalist known for demanding impossible efforts from his soldiers, recognizes that the entire Ardennes operation has failed. Germany threw 28 divisions against Allied lines, achieved tactical surprise, advanced up to 100 kilometers at some points, and ultimately accomplished nothing except consuming irreplaceable resources. The American, British, and Canadian armies remain intact. Supplies continue flowing through Antwerp, and spring offensive plans toward Germany proceed with minimal delay. Hitler's last Western gamble has failed completely. The post-battle analysis conducted by American logistics officers, examining captured German vehicles and documents, reveals how close the Germans came to complete operational collapse, even before American counterattack. Fuel samples taken from abandoned Panther tanks show contamination from desperate crew efforts to mix gasoline with diesel, attempts that would have destroyed engines if vehicles had continued operating. Maintenance logs document mechanical failures at rates suggesting German armor was literally falling apart from sustained high-tempo operations without adequate maintenance. Ammunition stocks in German positions show calibers mixed incorrectly, suggesting supply chaos where any shells were shipped forward regardless of whether they matched available weapons. And personal diaries from German soldiers reveal hunger, exhaustion, and declining belief in victory weeks before Sel's fighting began. One entry, dated December 20th from a German lieutenant killed at Sels, reads, "We advance toward objectives we cannot hold with resources we don't have. Victory is promised daily. I stopped believing in December 1943. The strategic impact of German losses in the Ardennes offensive extends far beyond territorial changes or casualty statistics. Germany loses approximately 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured during the offensive, 800 tanks and assault guns, 1,000 aircraft, and fuel stocks representing months of hoarded reserves. These losses occur at the exact moment when Soviet winter offensive opens on the Eastern Front, when Allied strategic bombing intensifies against German cities, when every resource is desperately needed for defense of German homeland itself. Hitler's strategic gamble to split Allied armies and force negotiated peace instead accelerates Germany's collapse by consuming final mobile reserves in offensive that achieves nothing. Military historians debate whether the Ardennes offensive shortened or lengthened the war. Most conclude it shortened war by approximately 6 weeks to 3 months, not by achieving German objectives, but by destroying German capability to conduct organized defense. The propaganda battles surrounding Celles and the broader Ardennes offensive reveal how both sides manipulate narrative for domestic consumption and international perception. German propaganda initially trumpets the offensive as proof of Germany's continued strength, inevitable victory, and Führer's Führer strategic genius. When the offensive collapses, German media shifts to emphasizing German soldier heroism, American material advantages, and mythical betrayals explaining defeat. Allied propaganda follows opposite trajectory, initial panic and uncertainty when German offensive begins, followed by triumphant celebration of crushing defeat of Hitler's armies once American forces stabilized the line. The Battle of Celles, in particular, gets highlighted as example of American tactical superiority, mechanical reliability, and moral righteousness, defeating German aggression. Both propaganda narratives oversimplify reality, but nations at war traffic in myths that sustain morale rather than truths that complicate necessary narratives. The civilian impact of the Ardennes offensive, often reduced to brief mentions in military histories focused on tactical operations, represents catastrophe for Belgian and Luxembourg populations caught between armies. An estimated 3,000 Belgian civilians died during the offensive from artillery, bombing, exposure, or murder by retreating German forces. Approximately 75,000 became refugees, fleeing westward ahead of German advance, many dying from exposure in winter conditions. Entire villages were destroyed completely, their populations scattered, communities that existed for centuries erased in weeks. The reconstruction of the Ardennes region, after the war, requires years and massive financial investment, both from Belgian government and American aid programs. For civilians, the tactical success at Cellars and strategic victory in the Ardennes provides small comfort when measured against homes destroyed, family members killed, and trauma that echoes through generations. January 1945. At Celles, Belgian civilians begin the slow process of rebuilding lives and community from ruins. They sort through rubble, looking for salvageable possessions, bury their dead in mass graves, because individual funerals are impossible when bodies number in dozens, try to establish some normalcy for traumatized children who witnessed violence that no human, let alone child, should experience. American military government provides some assistance, food rations, medical supplies, tentage for temporary shelter, but resources are limited because Allied logistics prioritizes military operations over civilian relief. Marie Dubois, who lost her son and home during the battle, begins living in the partially intact cellar of her destroyed house. She's 63 years old, alone, without resources or realistic hope of rebuilding. When American relief workers ask what she needs, she responds, "I need my son back. I need my home. I need December 15th, before the Germans came. Can you give me that?" They cannot. Nobody can. This is war's true cost for civilians, not just material destruction, but the theft of futures, the annihilation of hope, the permanent loss of worlds that can never be recovered. The debate over whether Germany could have won if they'd captured Allied fuel supplies at Celles represents favorite counterfactual for military historians and amateur strategists. Some argue that seizing American fuel dumps would have enabled continued German advance, breakthrough to the Meuse River, potential encirclement of Allied forces. But serious analysis reveals this scenario is fantastical. Even with additional fuel, German forces faced overwhelming Allied air superiority, once weather-cleared numerical inferiority in armor and infantry, artillery disadvantages, and most critically strategic depth problem, where every kilometer advance stretched supply lines further beyond sustainable logistics. Germany in December 1944 lacked industrial capacity, trained replacement troops, adequate air cover, and strategic reserves necessary to exploit tactical success, even if they achieved it. The Ardennes offensive was strategically bankrupt, regardless of tactical outcomes at Celles. Capturing fuel supplies would have enabled Germans to advance perhaps another 20 kilometers before being destroyed slightly farther west. The fundamental arithmetic of material warfare doesn't change based on one tactical outcome. The timeline shift caused by the Ardennes offensive represents perhaps its most significant strategic impact. Eisenhower's planned spring offensive into Germany, originally scheduled for February 1st, 1945, gets delayed until March, because divisions and supplies must first be reconstituted after Ardennes fighting. This 6-week delay arguably prolongs the European war by similar timeframe, allowing Germany additional weeks to conscript remaining males into desperate defense, to continue Holocaust operations against surviving Jewish populations, and to subject German civilians to additional bombing and eventual Soviet occupation atrocities. Measured against these consequences, Hitler's decision to launch Ardennes offensive appears not just militarily disastrous, but morally catastrophic. Resources consumed at Celles and across the Ardennes could have defended Germany proper, potentially shortened the war, reduced both German and Allied casualties in war's final months. Instead, ideological fantasy about reversing inevitable defeat produced offensive that achieved nothing except magnifying total war's horror. The memorialization of cells begins even before fighting ends, as American public relations officers recognize the battle's symbolic importance. Cells represents the moment when German offensive reached its farthest advance and broke against American defense, making it perfect narrative focal point for explaining Ardennes' campaign to audiences at home. War correspondents produce stories emphasizing American heroism, technological determination, and moral superiority. Military historians begin collecting after-action reports and unit diaries that will form basis of official histories. And Belgian officials, despite their community's destruction, cooperate with American efforts to document the battle, because Allied victory means liberation, even when liberation's cost seems unbearable. This process, creating official memory from chaotic reality, inevitably simplifies complexity and ignores contradiction. The Battle of Cells enters history as American tactical victory, strategic turning point, example of armor warfare done correctly. The trauma, waste, questionable decisions, and sheer luck that determined outcomes get minimized or erased entirely. As January 1945 progresses, as Allied armies regain territory lost during German offensive and prepare to cross into Germany itself, the Battle of Cells fades from immediate attention. New battles, new objectives, new crises demand focus. But for participants, for survivors, for families who lost sons and husbands and fathers, Cells remains defining experience that shadows everything afterward. American veterans will dream about burning tanks and friends who died for decades. German survivors will carry shame and trauma from defeat and imprisonment. Belgian civilians will rebuild homes, but never fully recover from watching their villages become battlefields. The aftermath of Cells demonstrates that battles don't end when shooting stops. They echo through lifetimes, shaping post-war societies, influencing how entire generations understand violence and sacrifice. The tide turned at Cells, but the human cost of that turn paid forward into futures that official histories rarely examine. Victory and defeat are temporary. Trauma is permanent. Present day. In the center of Celles, Belgium, a preserved M4 Sherman tank sits on a concrete pedestal facing east, toward the direction German forces approached in December 1944. A plaque beside it, in French, Flemish, and English, commemorates American 2nd Armored Division's defense of the village during the Battle of the Bulge. Belgian schoolchildren on field trips pose for photographs in front of the Sherman, laughing and climbing on the treads, having no visceral understanding of what this tank represents. The elderly guide, a retired teacher whose grandfather fought in the resistance during the war, tries to convey the battle's significance. "This is where Hitler's last offensive stopped," he tells the children. "This is where young men from America saved our village by destroying it." The children don't understand the paradox. They see a tank, a monument, history safely contained in metal and stone. They cannot imagine, cannot be made to understand what it meant to be here when the tank was firing, when the buildings burned, when the dead lay in streets they walk through casually now. The veterans who return to Cells in their final decades, men now in their 80s and 90s, experience the landscape differently than tourists or schoolchildren. William Henderson, who commanded a Sherman platoon in Combat Command A during the battle, returns in 2003 for the first time since 1944. He walks through the village center, sees rebuilt houses where he remembers rubble, stands in the square where his tank destroyed a German Panther. "It's too clean," he tells the Belgian family hosting him. "Too peaceful. I can't reconcile this place with my memories." He describes haltingly how the square looked on December 26th. Burning buildings, destroyed vehicles, bodies frozen in snow. His hosts listen politely, but they weren't born when the battle happened. Their grandparents lived through it. Their parents heard stories, but direct memory has passed. Henderson recognizes that his experience, the most defining event of his life, is becoming history that nobody truly remembers. He returns to the United States and dies 6 months later. The memories die with him. German veterans who survived cells face more complicated legacy. Günther Schultz, who served as a Panther gunner in 2nd Panzer Division, Tesitur Panzer Division, and was captured at Celles on December 27th, spends 40 years refusing to discuss the war. His daughter, researching family history in the 1980s, discovers that he fought in the Battle of the Bulge and asks questions he won't answer. "I was a soldier," he says finally. "I followed orders. I did nothing shameful." But he won't elaborate, won't describe what he saw or did, carries guilt and trauma that he cannot articulate even to family. Only in the 1990s, after German reunification and changing attitudes about Wehrmacht culpability in Nazi crimes, does he participate in oral history project documenting German veteran experiences. "We thought we were defending Germany," he tells the interviewer. "We didn't understand that we were defending a criminal regime. I've spent 50 years trying to reconcile what I believed then with what I know now. I haven't succeeded." The United States Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas uses the Battle of Celles as case study in armor warfare and logistics planning. Military students analyze German operational planning, American defensive response, tactical decisions at company and battalion level, logistical factors determining outcomes. The teaching objectives emphasize that tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic impossibility, that logistics determines operational capability more than fighting spirit or technological superiority, that command decisions must account for ground truth rather than preferred narratives. The lesson plans, refined over decades, reduce cells to decision points and learning objectives. Students engage intellectually with problems that participants experienced as life or death crises. This transformation from lived experience to academic exercise is necessary for institutional learning, but it also completes the process of abstracting human suffering into professional development. The young officers studying cells will never fully understand what it meant to be there, and perhaps that's necessary for them to function as commanders making decisions that send others to face similar situations. The archaeological investigations conducted at Celles battlefield in 2006 and 2012 reveal artifacts that official histories obscure. Belgian farmers ploughing fields that were frozen battlegrounds, regularly unearthed tank parts, shell casings, personal items from soldiers who died there. Formal archaeological surveys conducted before construction of new housing developments discover mass burial sites, improvised German positions, American foxholes preserved in soil stratigraphy. Each artifact tells microhistory that challenges or complicates official narratives. Personal letters found in German positions describe hunger, fear, and declining belief in victory weeks before the battle. American dog tags discovered in unlikely locations suggest casualties never officially recorded. Belgian civilian artifacts, children's toys and household items mixed with military debris demonstrate how completely warfare consumed communities that wanted only to survive. These physical remnants of Celles resist neat historical narratives, insisting on complexity and contradiction that professional histories often smooth over. The debate over Wehrmacht culpability in Nazi crimes affects how German participation at Celles gets remembered and interpreted. For decades after the war, German military memoirs and histories promoted the clean Wehrmacht myth that regular army units like 2nd Panzer Division were professional soldiers fighting for Germany, separate from SS atrocities and Holocaust operations. More recent scholarship, particularly since the 1990s, demonstrates this separation is false. Many 2nd Panzer Division soldiers had Eastern Front experience, including likely participation in anti-partisan operations that deliberately targeted civilians. The division's advance through Belgium included well-documented instances of soldiers murdering Belgian civilians suspected of resistance activity, and organizational records show the division cooperated with SS units in Poland and Russia during operations with genocidal components. This historical reassessment complicates simple narratives about brave soldiers on both sides fighting honorably. The German soldiers at Sels were, simultaneously, individual human beings worthy of empathy and participants in criminal regimes' operations. Holding both truths simultaneously is difficult but necessary for honest historical understanding. The material legacy of Sels extends beyond preserved tanks and monuments. Farmers throughout the Ardennes region continue discovering unexploded ordnance, shells, and grenades that failed to detonate during the battle. Remaining dangerous 8 decades later, Belgian bomb disposal units respond to dozens of calls annually, recovering and destroying munitions that could kill unsuspecting civilians. In 2014, construction workers excavating for a shopping center near Sels discovered an American 500-pound bomb buried 12 feet underground, still live, requiring evacuation of surrounding neighborhoods while specialists performed controlled detonation. These periodic discoveries demonstrate that warfare's physical consequences persist far longer than tactical operations. The ground at Sels, literally saturated with explosive material during 4 days of intense combat, remains contaminated by violence that shows no signs of disappearing naturally. Post-traumatic stress disorder among Battle of the Bulge veterans, documented through Veterans Administration records and academic studies, shows elevated rates compared to other European theatre participants. The combination of winter conditions, tactical surprise, high-intensity combat, and in many cases witnessing friends die in burning vehicles created trauma that many veterans never fully processed. Studies from the 1980s and 90s analyzing PTSD prevalence among Bulge veterans find 40 to 50% report symptoms consistent with diagnosis, including nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and difficulty maintaining relationships. Henderson, the Sherman commander who returned to Sels in 2003, told his daughter before dying, "I came home from the war in 1945. But part of me never left Belgium. Part of me is still in that tank, watching my friends burn, making decisions that got men killed." You think victory means wholeness. It doesn't. We won the battle. We lost pieces of ourselves. The tactical lessons from Sels, codified into United States Army armor doctrine over subsequent decades, emphasize several principles that post-war analysis identified as crucial to American success. First, numerical superiority compensates for technological inferiority when properly applied. Second, logistics determines operational capability more than tactical skill. Third, combined arms coordination, multiplying effectiveness of individual weapon systems. Fourth, air support, when weather permits, decisively influences ground combat outcomes. Fifth, intelligence advantages enable preemptive response, preventing enemy from consolidating tactical success. And sixth, mobile defense and counterattack, proving more effective than purely positional warfare when facing numerically inferior but tactically skilled enemy. These lessons, learned through blood at Sels and across the Ardennes, shape American armor doctrine throughout Cold War and influence planning for conflicts from Korea through Gulf War. The young men who died at Sels purchased knowledge with their lives that served strategic purposes they never understood. The question that haunts serious analysis of Sels focuses not on whether Germany could have won, but on whether the battle was necessary at all. If Hitler had authorized timely withdrawal when 2nd Panzer Division's fuel crisis became apparent, if German High Command had conserved forces for defense of Germany rather than wasting them in offensive that couldn't succeed, would the war's final months have unfolded differently? Most historians conclude the answer is no strategically, but yes tactically. Germany's strategic situation was hopeless by December 1944, regardless of Ardennes' offensive. But conserving forces wasted at Sels might have enabled more effective defense of Rhine River crossings, potentially delaying Allied advance by weeks or months, affecting which portions of Germany fell to Western Allies versus Soviets. This alternative timeline possibly saves German civilians from Soviet occupation atrocities while subjecting different populations to similar horrors. The counterfactual demonstrates that there were no good options by late 1944, only choices between different categories of catastrophe. The civilian memory of SEALs, maintained through Belgian community traditions and commemoration ceremonies, emphasizes both gratitude for liberation and acknowledgement of liberation's cost. Annual memorial services on December 26th feature addresses by community leaders thanking American forces for defeating German occupation, while simultaneously recognizing that the battle destroyed much of the village. This complicated gratitude, appreciating rescue while mourning its price, reflects civilian experience of warfare that liberator narratives often simplify. The civilians at Seals didn't choose to become a battlefield. They wanted neither German occupation nor the violence of liberation. But history gave them no alternative options, forcing them to survive consequences of decisions made by governments and militaries, treating their village as tactical objective rather than lived community. Post-war generations struggle to maintain this nuanced memory against pressures to reduce the battle to simple liberation narrative that serves nationalistic purposes but obscures civilian suffering. The fading of direct memory, as the last veterans and civilian survivors die, transforms how Sels gets remembered and understood. The battle is becoming history rather than living memory, entering the realm of books and museums and academic analysis rather than testimony from people who were there. This transition inevitably loses texture and complexity that direct experience provides. The preserved Sherman tank in Sels Village Square tells official story about American heroism and German defeat. It doesn't convey the smell of burning flesh, the sound of men screaming inside destroyed tanks, the weight of decisions that got subordinates killed, the trauma that survivors carried for lifetimes. Perhaps this loss is necessary. Perhaps societies cannot function while maintaining visceral understanding of warfare's full horror. But it means that future generations will know Sels primarily through sanitized narratives that emphasize tactical lessons and strategic significance, while obscuring human cost that participants understood too completely. The final assessment of Seller's significance requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. It was an American tactical victory, achieved through material superiority and adequate doctrine rather than brilliant generalship. It was the farthest advance of Germany's last Western offensive, the point where strategic impossibility became undeniable even to ideological fantasists. It was catastrophic defeat for German forces that could not afford the losses. It was liberation for Belgian communities that paid devastating price for freedom. It was trauma for participants on all sides that echoed through lifetimes. It was case study in how logistics and industrial capacity determine modern warfare outcomes more than fighting spirit or tactical skill. And it was ultimately unnecessary tragedy that occurred because totalitarian leadership refused to accept defeat until forced to through maximum bloodshed. These perspectives don't contradict each other. They coexist as facets of complex historical event that resists reduction to simple narratives about good versus evil or victory versus defeat. 4 kilometers. That's how close the German spearhead came to the Meuse River at Selles. Close enough to see the bridges through the fog, close enough to imagine what crossing might mean. But distance measured in kilometers tells us nothing about impossibility measured in logistics, strategy, and exhausted men fighting for a regime already defeated. The Battle of Selles was Germany's farthest reach, and the moment when reach exceeded grasp by such margin that the entire Third Reich's fate was sealed. The frozen ground around Selles holds 82 destroyed German tanks, hundreds of dead soldiers, and the end of any possibility that Nazi Germany could win its war. That the battle happened at all reveals desperation. That it failed so completely reveals inevitability. And that young men died there, on both sides, for nothing they could truly believe in. That reveals the deepest truth of 1944. The war was already over. Some just hadn't stopped fighting yet. The legacy of Selles isn't found in monuments or military doctrine or tactical analysis. It's found in the recognition that warfare's human costs persist far longer than tactical operations, that victory and defeat are temporary categories, but trauma is permanent, and that the young men who fought at Selles, regardless of nationality, deserved better than to die in frozen Belgian fields for strategies that had already failed before the first shot was fired. This is what Selles teaches. If we're willing to learn, war's deepest truths lie not in tactical success or strategic significance, but in the permanent wounds inflicted on individuals, families, and communities who never chose to be part of history's violence. The farthest reach wasn't measured in kilometers to the Meuse River. It was measured in how far warfare can push human beings beyond breaking points, how much suffering can be justified through appeals to duty and honor and necessity, and how little those justifications mean to the people who paid the price. Selles was 4 kilometers from the Meuse River. Selles was 4 kilometers from the Meuse River. It was 4 kilometers from meaningless victory that would have accomplished nothing, and it was 4 days of hell for people who deserved peace. That's the legacy worth remembering.